Yeah.
Obviously, well, I've seen it on your posts, some of the shit that
Yeah,
people
I
have
mean,
done as well.
it's absolutely, it's amazing when you say 2 years. I can't believe it's been that long. And I look back on when the first time I started posting and arguing with some of the real extreme stuff. I can't believe how long it's been, and with your missus as well. I think having someone on the front line do something like this, I've not seen a lot of that. You usually just see these viral videos of that guy the other day who was saying stuff that's just fodder for anti-vaxxers, and it
Yeah,
wasn't meant to be like that. But it's
yeah.
like, well, we don't get enough of a frontline account, I don't think.
Yeah, well, we can bring him up later because there's been a few things that have popped up about him. One doctor that is really interesting though, and it's someone I recommended on a previous episode of the podcast, doctor called Rachel Clark. She's wrote a book called Breathless. It's on my shelf actually. What's it called? Breathtaking. And she's a palliative care doctor, and basically, she just talked about the entire experience from within the NHS. So
Yeah.
yeah, really interested. And there's other a really mad example the other day. Before we get into, we'll go into music, but just before we do, doctor called Philip Lee on Twitter. He's quite well known. He's got like 70,000 followers. He's
Okay.
actually one of the main consultants at the same hospital where my missus works.
Oh, wow.
And a couple of days ago, after that doctor's video went viral, there was an entire hashtag on Twitter of get vaccinated and vaccines work and stuff like that. And he tweeted it, and there were hundreds upon hundreds of abusive tweets aimed at him saying he was part of the deep state, he was a bot, and I felt so tempted to reply to him, just be like, no, like we legitimately know this guy. But I can't just bring myself into it. But yeah,
Yeah, why get involved? Twitter's just a bottomless pit of
yeah,
nonsense at times. So
it's absolutely crazy. But we'll get into a full discussion about that a little bit later on. We'll do a quick intro for this episode of the Over the Hill podcast. Special guest today is well, when we say he's a man of science, we're not joking. He's a literal virologist, someone who knows what he's talking about in the field of science. But he's also one of my other kinds of favorite types of people: house DJ, producer, club promoter, record label owner, and just all-round general nice guy from the things that I've seen, and someone who I'm really pleased and privileged to have on the podcast today, the one and only Mr. Kieren Lythgow. Mate, thank you so much for being here. How's life treating you, and how's 2022 been so far in the first early few days?
yeah, thanks very much, James. It's a pleasure to be on, and it's good to chat to you. Yeah, I mean, this year it started very quickly. Straight after getting back after Christmas, hit the ground running again at work, and that's just all kinds of stuff going on at work. A lot of admin things. But yeah, I'm hoping that this year is going to be much better than the last two. It is looking a lot better now, and I'm quite hopeful, not just on the work side of things, but obviously the event side, DJing opportunities and things like that. Last year was, as everyone will say, pretty rubbish. We did get a chance to the latter end of the year to do some events, but it wasn't the same at all. It's been really hard work and really kind of disheartening because the numbers weren't the same. And again, there's this divide in the music community as well, where people are arguing online all the time.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I was going to touch on that a little bit later on with you when we have a bit more of a discussion about the science and the way things have gone for people in the sense of lockdowns and restrictions and things. But wanted to really dig deeper still into your music career. How did you get started in the game? What were some of your early DJ influences? And do you remember buying your first set of decks?
I do, yeah. It's just can't believe how long ago it was, but it just doesn't seem that way. Um, So it was back in around about 1994. I got interested in the idea of DJing, and what I actually did was, because I couldn't afford decks, I didn't even know what you needed at that point. I was only 14. Um, I actually got my sister's hi-fi, my hi-fi, and a sort of separate ghetto blaster, and was recording the worst reel-to-reel mixing you can imagine.
I
By pressing
love that
stop.
you have said this, and I hate the fact that I've had to cut you off there, but I love that you've said this because so many of my guests, including myself, have either had one turntable on the hi-fi and doing their little speed up bit with a
Yeah.
CD player plugged into a speaker, or one guy I know actually was playing hip hop videos on a VHS on his TV whilst double time mixing on a deck with jungle records. So I love it. Please continue, mate. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, that's really inventive. I mean, obviously in 1994, I was buying a lot of tape packs, and there were used to be, I was actually into happy hardcore just because I was, I was a kid, so I didn't know any better. But that's where my transition to listening to sort of Fantasia house music, the early Fantasia stuff that was coming through. Um, and that's where I started to notice that I liked much more of the houseier side of stuff. But that's where I started, I had a lot of tapes where I could try stuff out. And yeah, it sounded absolutely dreadful. But then I started working, and I managed to get a few £100 together, and just thought, right, I'm getting some decks. And I think that was 1996. I remember them turning up, got back from school, and it was just the most exciting few months ever, because I just dived in, I was buying vinyl, and just spent all spare hours mixing. It took me ages to work out what the hell you were supposed to do. I had no idea the concept of what beat matching really was at that point. So completely self-taught from scratch there, really. And the early influences range from sort of Cal Cox, obviously, because he was very involved in the early scene, the rave scene. A lot of illegal rave tapes. I don't know if you remember Illegal Rave 1, 2, and 3. DJ Vertigo, a lot of Bradford DJs, and Savage, Arc and Fantasia DJs. And then I moved to more of the sort of, I was very influenced by people like Alistair Whitehead and Graham Park, and I loved the vocal side of house music. So I kind of moved all the way from happy hardcore to a much more sort of cooler sound.
Graham Park's actually one of my favorite DJs. He played one of my favorite sets at a Southport Weekender a few years back, probably about 2014, 2015. And yeah, it was fairly early on in the night, but he just played a lot of real classic house, and the Moose T remix of Quincy Jones, and just like really, really great soulful bumping US house stuff. And
Yeah,
he's got a few sets that he's put up on Mixcloud over the years that are just live from festivals and stuff, and
yeah.
always a good vibe. Such an underappreciated DJ, man. Like, he's a DJ's DJ, that guy. He really is.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, he's been in it for so long now, and he's still, like you said, the Mixcloud series he does. Um, Again, the early influences were a bit of a range. There was Sasha and Digweed, the first Renaissance album, the first Cream Live album, all those early sort of mix compilations, if you like, because there weren't anything like that. The Mystery of Sound did the Sessions series with, Paul Oakenfold and Tony Humphries. And it was that idea, then you had something to kind of reference. You weren't old enough to go clubbing, but you had right, this is what mixing's supposed to sound like, because you started listening more intently. And yeah, it just grew and grew from there. I then went to university and picked up as many opportunities there as I could. I entered a lot of DJ competitions, actually. And I think with vinyl, there was a lot of different tricks you could do that you kind of, the pioneer now, there's so many technical things you can do, but there was stuff you could do on vinyl that was a little bit more of a showmanship, that had kind of lost a bit now. And yeah, I did pretty well in them, and I just thought, I just want to continue this.
So in terms of, you're one of, I'm guessing summarized is, partly your event, and your label. So is obviously going from strength to strength as well. When did things really start to pick up for you, in terms of club bookings and actually getting recognized on the scene and starting to build a following locally and be able to start building a brand for yourself?
So after I'd gone to uni, I spent a long time at uni, and I never really put too much attention in getting a lot of regular gigs until I got to London. And I realised I still had this raging passion that I wanted to get out there and play. And I entered a competition with DJ Mag, and it was like a worldwide mix sort of DJ competition. Did very well in that, and used that to get gigs because obviously when you're messaging promoters through Facebook and stuff, when you're completely unheard of, you really are banging your head against a brick wall. And I know people are still trying to do that. But I managed to get involved with a brand called Momentum, which did a lot of early Giggling events. And within 3 months, I was playing in the 103 at Ministry of Sound, which was just mind-blowing because, I'd gone from getting nothing to getting some really quite cool gigs on boat parties. And then I was in the Ministry of Sound, and that just gave me so much impetus to carry on.
Wowzers. Yeah, it's a difficult one, because even as someone who was in the game on pirate radio myself for quite a long time, when we had our record label and stuff, you do find yourself just knocking on just so many closed doors, trying to have conversations with people. And I'll be completely honest, even with the podcast now, I mean, there's people that I've had on that are still friends within the industry, and people that I didn't really know before who've been kind enough to come on. Shouts out to likes of Scott Diaz, who I know you're familiar with.
Yeah.
The people that are like, happy to lend their time and happy to listen to what you're doing and stuff like that. But it's really, really difficult for young DJs now to actually make a way for themselves. I think the only way to do it is probably by producing, which I know is something that you've turned your hand to as well.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there is another way, and Shane Fernandez, who owns Sunrise Sessions, who I've worked closely with for years, has shown that he's recently got in production as well. But he was the other side of this, where if you run a party and you put a lot of passion and effort into doing it properly, that can also get you very well noticed by doing that side of things well. So there is another way of going in, and you're always going to have gigs if you do your own parties.
Yeah.
So networking is one of the top things you can do. Physically getting out there and meeting people, and blind messaging people is not really. It's always the advice I give if someone messages. I just say, look, come down to one of our events and meet the team.
Yeah.
And the people that do and that aren't weirdos or anything usually do all right and get some gigs.
Well, one thing we've discovered the last couple of years is the world's full of weirdos. In terms of production, how did that get started for you? Because I know you've had a lot of releases out, and seem to be going from strength to strength this year. I do briefly, as much as I don't really collect too much house music anymore, I do still keep an eye on who's doing what on my timeline. And I've seen, you've been somewhat successful this year, and all credit to you. Where did the production start for you, and how did you get into it, and how difficult did you find it? Because I know I've never actually produced a single on my own, but I've executive produced for people on our label, and I've sat in the studio for countless hours with people and final like music for them and stuff like that, and just been like, this should be here, let's get this mixed down, blah blah blah. But the patience to be able to sit and learn from scratch is something that I was never ever capable of mastering. How was it for you?
Well, that's what I thought as well, because I downloaded Logic and then just started messing around, and I was able to kind of start doing some sort of mashups of tracks already, rearranging acapellas and things, and I got quite into doing that for a while and putting them on SoundCloud and things. And then I thought I should really, go in and give it a good chance of producing my own music. And I just thought it was going to be this really kind of tough uphill battle. So I thought, instead of trying to self-teach you something that technical, do a course. And that's what I thought, was the best plan. So I actually joined Subbase Academy. Di Ramirez had done sort of like a free session early on in that year. I think this was about 7 years ago. And Di Ramirez, as everyone knows in the scene, is an absolutely amazing producer and a brilliant tutor as well. So on the back of that, I joined Subbase, and I was actually taught by a guy called Fabio Lendrum, who's absolutely superb engineer. And he then started doing one-on-ones with me. So after I did the course, I think it was about 3 months, I started having one-on-ones. So I decided I wanted to learn as much technical stuff off him, and go forwards by not just having this course and forgetting about it, having top-up sessions with him all the time. And within a few months, I was able to knock out a pretty basic track within a couple of hours. But I think the real ones that stand out, you've got to have a lot more sort of input into it, rather than anyone who makes a track in 2 hours, it's a bit, you can kind of tell. But yeah, he's been great as Fabio.
I think one of the only stories I've ever heard of someone making a track in 2 hours and it's actually been any good was when MK made the remix of Push the Feeling. That's the only time I think it's ever
Yeah.
they've ever told the story and you've gone, yeah, do you know what? I can imagine that happening, and fair play, because it's probably the biggest house sound of all time.
Well, someone like MK can, so
Yeah. That's the thing. I think you get a lot with producers nowadays as well, where the template is already there, especially if they already have a particular sound. I had DJ Naughty on a few episodes ago, who was one of the pioneers of the UK funky scene, and that whole scene there, Crazy Cousins, was so big around 10 13 years ago, 10 12 years ago. and they just, every one of their songs had almost the same samples, the same patterns, everything was like there. They just went in and threw whatever remix vocal that they needed to put on it, and it was job done. So if
a
you're
lot of
working,
that, unfortunately, is in Beatport. I'm hearing it all the time. The same artists are doing any remix or any new track they cut out. It's these exact same drums, and I just can't understand how A, they want to do that, and B, they're still popular.
I think that's the other side of what we were talking about before, though, where we say, you've either got to go out and network and do everything. I think a lot of it is, I say this as an armchair critic now, quite literally. It's a question of just putting out as much content as possible and just throwing shit at the wall and hoping it sticks, because it's just, the more you're out there, the more your name's up there, you might creep up into a few Traxsource charts, the more likely you are to work your way into something, whereas other producers that don't have a record out from 6 months to the next, they just come out with a masterpiece and you're like, whoa, where'd this come from?
I think it's there's a lot of, like, Michael Beebe's a good example of someone who was doing a lot of production in the background, and people weren't as familiar with his name, and then all of a sudden they thought he'd blown up, but it's like, well, there's this whole history of hard work behind him. And another recent young artist is Rossi, who seems to be, I think what his plan was is to just build up a great catalogue of great music and then just strategically release it on top labels. And I think you've got a much more better way of progressing by doing something like that.
In terms of yourself, how many tracks have you actually had out now?
Nowhere near as many as I would have liked. I found, and I've spoken to a lot of producers about this, the pandemic just stripped away the, there was nothing to kind of go on, because when you're going out, you're gigging and stuff, there was no impetus to go back and write out, I'm going to write a track. It kind of was lost a little bit. So I think, off the top of my head, about 12 maybe, a couple of remixes in there. But yeah, I'm hoping this year I can really get back to a lot more production.
So in terms of Summarise Session, I see you guys are playing up and down the country, man. It's like, it's really great to see. I mean, back in the day, myself and my friend Eamon James, we had a brand called Education, and it was very local. It was South and West London only. We did several parties, Pasha residency being our main thing, about 10 years ago. But it was only ever a local brand. It was only because, we had 200 or 300 people in the local area. We both live around the corner from each other. We knew we could bring those people to a venue, but you guys are just smashing it, coast to coast almost. What's the deal behind the brand, and how well have things gone? Obviously, pandemic notwithstanding, but you guys were clearly doing something before that, and you've clearly been doing something since the reopening. So how have you made it go from strength to strength, and how are you able to sustain going to so many different venues and still being able to draw a crowd?
Yeah, I think Summarise Sessions, I think this is its 9th year. So Shane set it up in 2013, very small parties. But I think he always had a sort of a very good idea of where he wanted to take it, and just did things very well. I mean, he within, I think it was 2 years later, 2015 is when I joined. I started running the podcast side of it, and just started helping him with the event organisation. So there was just us two really at the start, and Donna Love was a resident from the off. And then we got to, I think, 93 Feet East, where the parties were starting to get hundreds. And we just had a great formula. The production we were putting on started off small. We were actually putting stuff up ourselves, which, looking back, was a complete nightmare. And then we progressed slowly from there. And the best point for me, I think it was 2017. Within 2 years, we were at the Steelyard, and I remember getting up. I think my set was around 1 a.m. and it was just an absolute sea of people. I think we had 1,200 people there, and I was just shell shocked, but absolutely buzzing, because we'd gone from these small parties in the Horse and Groom in Shoreditch to just playing, to a normal pub crowd, to this massive event, and it was just. There's so much work that had gone into it, and we're a pretty big team now. I think there's about 10 or more of us now, and everyone is just firing on all cylinders. So yeah, it's been a lot of hard work, but it really does pay off.
Yeah, man, it's good to have a solid team around you. I've been around a lot of promotions over the years where you'll have that one person that kind of wants to be a control freak, and that's when you'll see the brand will go from being something special. There's a tipping point. There's always a point where you just go, one member of the team that's a key person will just have enough, leave,
Yeah,
and you'll just see the decline. So I think the people around you are always going to be key with anything in life, but in terms of actually keeping something a success and being able to build on it, it's obviously really important. In terms of the people that you've booked and the artists that you've had play for you, who are some of your favorite DJs that you've been able to actually bring into the brand, and how's that experience been for you? Because I know myself growing up listening to a load of big, house and garage DJs, and then going on to like warm up for them or play alongside them has always been a big
mm.
experience. So in terms of being able to have your own massive events, like you say, Steel Yard and all these other big venues and around the UK, who have been some of your favorite people that you've been able to bring into the brand?
So I remember, I mean, there's quite a few. I'll try and quickly go through some of them. It was about 2012, I think. I started listening to Scott Diaz. Discovered him on SoundCloud, listened to his mixes, thought it was absolutely wicked. And then over the years, just being a fan of his, getting to a point where we were able to book him and meet Scott as well in person. We've had him play for us a few times. He's even released on our label, and I even had the opportunity to remix for him. So to go from being this big fan of someone who I was really kind of, never thought you'd meet or anything, to this point where we're friends and I could do that. That's been brilliant. And I know you like Scott as well, so that's always been a bonus. And I've been a huge fan of a fellow Bradfordian, Darius Syrossian.
Great producer. Wow.
Yeah, I mean, I've been a fan of his since the 90s, from when he was starting out. And through conversations, we've realised that I probably bought vinyl off him in the 90s from the record shop he worked in, long before he became a big superstar. And we actually had a recent event where a DJ had to cancel. He was flying in from France, but there was an issue with his PCR test, so he couldn't make it. And we had 4 hours to go, no headliner. So I gave Darius a ring because I knew he was in London, and he ended up being a secret last minute headliner for us. Wow. Which was amazing, because that was the first time I actually got to meet him. So being able to do things like that is just amazing, because you're like, a few years ago, I would never have thought that would ever happen.
It tends to have a lot of banter on your Facebook status as well, which I'm sure we'll get into.
Yeah, he has no time for these idiots either.
Yeah, he seems a good dude. Before we do get into that, though, I wanted to talk about the future for yourself in terms of production and what you've got going on for 2022 and some of the parties that you guys have got going on, man. What's cracking for the spring and the summer?
So I think we have some parties lined up for March. We do a lot of day parties as well. So we do the Prince of Wales and Brixton, and we're always looking for new venues. I think this year we're really going to step up the game. We're going for bigger venues. I mean, obviously we're doing around the country that are around about sort of between 600 and 800 capacity. Steelyard around 1,000. But I think we're wanting to try and aim for almost doubling that, and really, really sort of take those measurable risks, if you like. And the label's going from strength to strength. We've got some very strong artists lined up for this year, and we want it to really take that to the next level as well. So yeah, we just want to try and compete with the big boys as much as possible.
Nice. Mate, long may it continue. I mean, if it's clearly doing its thing, as I say, I love the fact that I can sit and go on Facebook and just look and be like, wow, Glasgow or wherever, just all these different places that you guys are getting around to. It's really, really great to see. And something that's kind of, it's just come from literally just people just working hard and doing it, man. It gives me, I think for me, I kind of left the scene a little bit bitter that things never really went the way they were supposed to with the amount of work that we did put in. But it was great to see that, people have done it. It's just, it doesn't give me hope because it's not something I'm getting back into, but it kind of takes the edge off and makes me feel a bit better. Like, yes, like when you see other people doing well, it's a good thing to see. It's just, that's coming from a place of being a pure music lover.
Well, it's like there's a lot of sweat and tears gone into it. Fortunately, so far, no blood.
Not yet, anyway. But I don't know. The anti-vax mob might start hunting you down soon, man. You got to be very careful.
Yeah. I might have to be one of these masked DJs like Route 94 or something.
No, they'll take your mask off, mate. You're not allowed to wear them either.
Oh God, yeah, that's a good point. I can't escape it.
Nah, definitely. And we can't escape it. And one of the main reasons I wanted to get you on the podcast was, as I say, I've been following your Facebook since the start of the pandemic. And it was something you said the other day about the Robert Malone and Joe Rogan podcast, where you kind of really tore down the bullshit that he was coming out with on Rogan. And I knew before he went on that he was a complete and utter shill. So it finally made me just go, do you know what? I've been following this guy for 2 years. It'd be a really great guest and I really want to reach out. But I wanted to, obviously I'll let you give out your credentials, but there was a Facebook status that you put up in April of 2020, and you'll probably know exactly which one it is I'm talking about, where it's really bizarre, and it will probably feed into some conspiracy theorists' bullshit about this being a pandemic. But you pretty much almost predicted exactly what was going to happen within the first 18 months of the pandemic. And it was when I read that, I read it a year later, and I remember sitting, it was when the pubs had opened and you could sit outside. And I remember sitting outside and was flicking through my phone, having a pint. And I looked and I went, oh, that was a status from a year ago. Jesus Christ, he's pretty much predicted the entire pandemic, literally down to the point where you've given 165,000 deaths, which is pretty much where we're at. The ONS is 170, the UK's estimate is 155. So you've kind of called it down to a T. And you've ended it with the line, drugs are being tested to treat severe cases, but a vaccine is the best hope we have. Anyone opposing that is a fucking idiot. Now, I couldn't agree more. But that was the status that really brought you to my attention. And yeah, I couldn't agree more with the final status. But your credentials within the game, because we're probably going to get into a bit of a deep convo now, and I want people to understand that I would never have this conversation with someone unqualified. How qualified? Let's just go with this. How qualified are you to talk about vaccinations and virology?
Okay, well, I'll just sort of explain what I've done over the years, because obviously there's always worldwide experts out there who have been doing a great job. So I did a degree in biology in Newcastle. I then went on to do, after a couple of years' work, I did a master's in genetics and a subject called bioinformatics, which I won't go too into because it's very almost dry, if you like. And then I went on to do after another 2 years of working as a junior research associate, I then went into doing a PhD in genetics as well. And I've had various jobs in the field of genetics, and mainly in disease research. But then I joined Public Health England in 2012. And that's when I got involved in a role in virology. So within 3 months of working there, I was already drafted in to help with analysing data from a MERS coronavirus outbreak. So I don't know if many people know about, in Saudi Arabia in 2012, there was an outbreak of a really dangerous coronavirus. It had around about 30% mortality rate. But fortunately, it wasn't spreading from human to human, anything
So
like
that was MERS. So that was Middle Eastern. SARS was Asian. And it's interesting, you'll probably be familiar with this, but I've recently been reading a book called Vaxxers by two professors that actually developed the Astrazeneca vaccine. And obviously I know you've worked with AstraZeneca and you're probably familiar with these people, but I was reading it and just, stunned when I never even really knew about MERS. So what was MERS?
So it's basically, MERS is Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome. So it's a virus that was causing severe acute respiratory distress in patients, and they quickly realised by epidemiological investigation and testing that most of the people who were becoming infected were having a direct interaction with camels. Camels are very sort of like we have cows over here. They use camels for milk and meat and things like that. So they're very sort of common to be farming these sorts of animals, and most of the infections were coming directly from the animals. And they quickly realised that it was an extremely dangerous virus because 30% of people were actually dying with the disease. So we got involved. I remember walking into the office that day and the senior virologist saying, look, we've got a novel coronavirus coming from the Middle East. It needs to be all hands on deck. So that was just such an exciting but also quite scary moment, because as soon as we did the analysis that day, we realized that it was extremely similar to SARS. And as soon as you find a virus that's similar to SARS, you know that it's a big problem. But within a few months, we'd already identified where this was coming from, and bats were involved and all that kind of stuff. And from then on, I was working on many different viruses, whether they were outbreaks or there were research projects. So I did a lot of work on HIV. That involved looking for mutations in the patient samples to see which drugs would work, which ones wouldn't. And then Ebola, worked on Ebola, Zika virus, and then sort of common STIs such as herpes, HPV, and a whole host of things like that. So it was just a very exciting role. And then I've been at Astrazeneca for 3 years, working on several COVID projects with them.
Well, so with HIV, herpes, and the STDs, it's really good to take that into the clubland as well, because that shit's rife on the dance floor, man.
Certainly is.
It's interesting. Now, I've been reading Vaxxers. I haven't quite finished it yet. Nowhere near finished it, in fact. And my knowledge about virology and stuff like that, it's very much in layman's terms. So if I hear you say something throughout the course of this discussion that I can kind of translate into that, random as language, then I'll do my best to, because it's interesting. When I was reading it, I think it's Sarah Gilbert and Kathy Newman. I can't remember the other woman's name, but really good book so far. And they were basically saying that one of the things that we've noticed during the time with the vaccines that have come out over the last year and a half, why did they make them so quick? How were they able to make them so quick? And you can probably explain this a little bit better, but from what I was reading, there's two main reasons that this vaccine was developed so quickly. One of the reasons being that the template was pretty much already there from the MERS virus. The other reason is because this was such a global catastrophe that world governments and businesses and the people who can fund and cut red tape for this kind of thing literally threw every resource imaginable at this virus and vaccine, for the simple reason that it was a pandemic. Like, it took over the entire planet. With other viruses, even with Ebola, which we were terrified of, and also Professor Gilbert was also one of the people that worked on Ebola as well, I'm sure, as you know. With all of that, like, that was never really widespread because they were able to contain it. With this, it was uncontainable. There was once it escaped China, that was it. It was game over. So I think that's a big misconception. Am I right in thinking that that's what it is? Is there was the template there and the financing just became available because it was such a drastic situation?
That's absolutely it. Yeah, the MERS vaccine platform was already there. So, I mean, the AstraZeneca Oxford vaccine is based on what's called an adenovirus viral vector, which uses an adenovirus to the virus that will actually take in the spike protein antigen. So it's like a Trojan horse, if you like. But obviously, we'll go on to the messenger RNA vaccines as well. But Sarah Gilbert, I think within the first week of receiving the actual genomic sequence of SARS-2, was already working on developing a vaccine, because at that point, she already knew the platform for MERS was there. And, you're talking about tweaking certain things rather than going from scratch. Yeah. So once you have the sequence information, then you know what you need to design your vaccine against. And she hit the ground running straight away, because the big difference between this and Ebola is a bloodborne disease. You have to be physically touching, the infected to actually get the virus. This is a respiratory airborne disease, and there's no real way of you're ever going to contain it, and we realised that quite early on. So yes, there's years and years of research that's gone into that. And there is a common misconception that it takes 10 years to make a vaccine. There's many reasons for why it takes so long. Usually, that boils down to being the financial incentive to make a vaccine from a pharmaceutical company. You're going to make far more money from treatment for chronic conditions such as heart disease and diabetes and things like that. So there isn't a financial incentive to make antibiotics, antivirals, or vaccines, because of resistance and changes to the microorganisms. The drugs eventually stop being as effective. So that's a major reason for this length of time it takes to develop these things is financial, because again, the idea of long-term effects from vaccines are vanishingly small. There are hardly any documented long-term effects from vaccines. It's usually in the short term when you see any kind of a side effect or really rare adverse event.
So you mean to tell me that the people that have been developing these vaccines for years are well aware of potential long-term side effects, and they know a little bit more than dickheads on Facebook? Remarkable, mate.
Exactly. Well, it's this whole argument where they seem to kind of not realize that, hang on a minute, this is, you've got the actual absolute experts working on it, but we're in an emergency pandemic. You don't have the luxury of just saying, well, let's wait for 5 years and just see what happens. Because what will happen in 5 years without any vaccines is we'll have tens of millions of dead people.
Yeah, exactly. And mutations, and the disease would have got worse. We're lucky in a sense, and we'll move on to Omicron in a bit, but we're lucky in a sense that this latest one has actually, despite the fact it's become more transmissible, it's weakened. I think viruses, you can correct me if I'm wrong because I'm an idiot, but I think this is, here's the difference, guys. For anyone watching and listening to this is almost like Rogan and Robert Malone. I am a self-confessed idiot, much like Joe Rogan. The difference is I'm an idiot that is willing to listen to actual experts in science, not someone who's being paid to spout bullshit. So there's the difference. But as an idiot, I might be right or wrong in thinking that viruses will do one of two things. They will either become more transmissible, less violent, or way more violent but less transmissible. It seems to be the balance.
Yeah, I mean, you look at Ebola, for example, in 2016, that outbreak. It was the Zaire strain, which in its first outbreaks in the Congo had a 90% mortality rate. But as that outbreak spread in 2016 to a lot of countries, and I think there was over 20,000 people infected, around about 11,000 died. So the actual mortality rate did start to drop. Well, there are several reasons for that, but there's no advantage for a virus to just keep killing its host so quickly. So there will be this kind of trend. But with SARS-CoV-2, it's unfortunate that it spreads very quickly when you're asymptomatic or pre-symptomatic. So this pressure to become less virulent isn't actually there. So I think Omicron is just a very fortunate, at this point, if it is seemingly mild, it's very fortunate because there is no selection pressure on it to become milder because it can spread so effectively before you get ill.
It's something I wanted to ask you actually at the very start was how easy was it as a decision for you to actually start speaking out on social media about the reality of this shit? Because, mate, for some of the comments that I've seen you have in the threads on your Facebook page, patience in part of a saint, but also sometimes just comebacks among comebacks. It's fucking hilarious. A particular favorite being when someone said to you, "Oh yeah, and what kind of scientific qualifications do you have to discuss this?" And it's literally like, virologist for like 20 years. I've done this, I've done that, and it was just pure silence. But it must have taken a hell of a lot of time and a hell of a lot of headache to start speaking out. How easy of a decision was it for you to just actually start saying, because you've not been rampant with it, you've not been on it every single day, but you will every couple of weeks put up something big and it creates an absolute shitstorm. So, how comfortable were you, starting to do that?
So I remember exactly when it was. We had an event in Manchester. So I think it was like the 19th of March, I think. It was that weekend. And it was it was time to lock down, but obviously they locked down, I think, a week later. We still went ahead with the party, but it was quite apparent that even without an official lockdown, people stopped wanting to go out.
Yeah.
Even our headliner cancelled because he had COVID. And it was just not a good thing no one really knew what to do around that point. I'd already been warning my parents a couple of weeks before then, saying, look, you need to stop letting people in the house, you need to stop going out, we'll get shopping sorted out for you and everything. And then it was on the train back from that event, I'd been seeing stuff online, and it was just I mean, early on, it was really stupid, outrageous nonsense.
Yeah.
And I kind of just had all these thoughts in my head, and I thought, I've been working in this field for so long. I'm just going to shoot a lot of this shit down. I think I did a bullet point list. And the reaction it got was really, really surprising. I didn't think it'd be anything like that at all. And I actually thought, stupidly, that things would just kind of calm down and social media would settle, not because of the post, but just in general. And it just went absolutely crazy. The misinformation online has just been really quite
What
shocking.
was some of your early favorites? Because I think mine was that if you drink, or if you go in the sun or you drink hot water, it will kill the virus because it can't survive at temperatures above 27, given that the average human body is at 37 degrees anyway. That was fucking hilarious to me. The 5G stuff was completely bonkers. One that I did see you knock back, and one that I wanted to bring up with you because you made a point that was spot on, the Bill Gates bullshit and this whole depopulation stuff, which is still something that anti-vaxxers use now. Now, I know, and you know what he actually said. This whole misquote from Bill Gates around depopulation, can you break it down for people?
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't believe it when I saw it. I just thought, watch his whole talk. I think it's on population and climate. And they'd taken this 3-minute excerpt out of it and totally twisted it around. But people fall for it. I think the people who did it probably knew who were doing it for some kind of nefarious banter or whatever. But to take that and not understand what he was talking about, and to assume that he was doing a TED talk and saying that we need to depopulate the earth by 3 billion or something, it's just like, what the it's like, there's no logic or rational reasoning around it. And what he was obviously talking about the growth rate, which is something David Attenborough has been talking about for well over 10 years, that we need to sort of understand we can't keep on growing as we are as a population. We need to really take it into account. The planet's not getting any bigger. And what his argument was boiling down to is, if you vaccinate, say in Africa, what they currently do is they have many, many children because so many of them die from preventable diseases. If you vaccinate them, they'll have less children. And what that actually means is people are having less children. So the population growth sort of slows down by providing better health. And yeah, it's just, there's people who just don't believe any of that. They think he's trying to kill everyone with vaccines, which makes no sense.
It's such a bizarre thing, because he's literally saying that, you know, we have people in the world who their survival rate's low, so they have X amount of children. It's like what we were saying earlier about people that put out 50 tunes on Beatport and they never go anywhere, but they have to do that in order to survive because they need people to see their name in lights. That's the same thing as having X amount of children in third world countries. And literally all he was saying is that if we vaccinate people, they die less, they have longer lives, they live better, they're healthier, people survive, but way less people taking up resources, causing problems, especially in third world countries where things are short. You know, this is the thing that people don't realize. We sit in a nice, safe Western bubble and think, oh, well, you know, 2.4 kids, everything's hunky dory. Like, mate, the rest of the world ain't like that. Like, just people don't live like that. And we're so, one thing that really fucks me off, and I'm sure it gets to you as well, is we are so privileged to have these vaccines and antivirals and stuff. And there's like my other half's from the Philippines, and there was a point, and even now, crying out for vaccination across a lot of Asia. Like, it's not a great place to be in the hotter countries, across most of Africa. You know, like, it's really, really dark and dangerous. And that's something that really, really bugs me, is the privilege that we've got to have this science and the people that we've got and the money that we've got behind it. And yet people are just sat here talking about Robert fucking Malone. Now, he was a guest on the Rogan podcast, and I've listened to parts of it. I couldn't listen to the whole thing because it made me just so pissed off. Can we break down, because you really did go to town on Facebook the other night, but who is Robert Malone, and you know, the story behind him, apparently inventing mRNA 20 years ago, but also according to anti-vaxxers, mRNA is a new technology that we can't trust. So I don't know how we suddenly have Robert Malone, who's this genius that actually invented mRNA 30 years ago and says we shouldn't use it, or anti-vaxxers who say the same guy, Robert Malone, invented mRNA, but no, actually it's a new technology, so we shouldn't be using it. Mate, I'm very confused. Who is Robert Malone and how much bullshit is he chatting?
So it goes all the way back to the 70s when people were actually sort of utilizing the idea of using messenger RNA in terms of introducing it into human cells for various reasons. Obviously, we already have our own messenger RNA, but introducing it to incorporate new proteins that we don't have that may allow us to, protect ourselves against certain diseases. And this was kind of started to begin around late 70s. There is a woman called Catalina Carrico who has been instrumental in the face of lots of adversity based on where she's from, and she's just kept going and going. And I think Robert Malone, he got involved in the late 80s. He did his PhD. I think he was doing a PhD. I don't think he completed it, but he did manage to discover a way of one of the ways of getting messenger RNA into what's called a lipid. And that means you're able to safely get it into the cell without being degraded by enzymes. So it's a very important step in terms of how these vaccines work, but it's not the step. There's been many, many different iterations and changes along the way. So you've got hundreds and hundreds of scientists who contribute to all these little steps, all these different challenges, and got it to the point where we're in 2020, 2021, where we've actually got vaccines that we can use as actual messenger RNA vaccines. So he stopped around then and decided to start working on DNA vaccines. So the messenger RNA stuff, he left in the late 80s, early 90s. So his contribution stopped then. And if he'd just played a better, more respectable role in all this, he may have, sort of not necessarily been up for a Nobel Prize. I think there's far more people who are going to be with a chance of getting it for what's been done here. But he was certainly being a highly respected scientist in contributing. But what he's actually done is, as far as I can see, he's tried to denigrate Catalina Carrico and others. He's really kind of felt that something he did 20 years ago is now obviously being a big savior in the pandemic as a vaccine. And I can only assume he's extremely bitter. So if he's not going to get any credit for it, he wants to try and dismantle everybody else. And watching these, not just him, Peter McCullough was on Joe Rogan a few weeks before, 3-hour things. I mean, I'm not sad enough to watch these at home. What I'll do is I'll listen to them in long car journeys, because I think that's the perfect time to just
shouts out to everyone who does happen to watch this podcast at home.
So it's a lot of time, but on car journeys can be so boring. So
yeah,
no,
mate, I'm the same. I listen. I walk to and from work for the most part, and I work about 3.5 miles away. It's an hour walk, so a podcast in the morning on the way there, and then the rest of it on the way back, and it's job done.
Yeah, I mean, it's perfect. I mean, we're talking 6 hours of material from these two guys, but as a scientist, as you're listening to these things, there's so many points where I'm like, what the fuck? And I'm just like, you are absolutely just fodder for the conspiracy theorists. And they're not talking to Joe Rogan for scientists to listen to, because they know scientists are going to be like, this is a total nonsense.
Yeah.
They're not there for those reasons. They're there to appeal to the people who are lapping up all the misinformation and then promoting it online.
Yeah, and a lot of them, not all of them, because some of them are just arseholes, but a lot of them are really, really caking it financially from this misinformation. The doctor from King's the other day that was who has since gone back on what he said, by the way.
Yes,
let's like not compartmentalize the one thing that he said, where he was talking about being anti-vax and anti-mandate, which we can get onto mandates, but I am slightly worried about where we are going with mandated vaccinations within the health service, despite being incredibly pro-vax. he actually runs like a breathlessness clinic and charges patients £500 an hour in his spare time for some bullshit holistic medicine nonsense.
This Dr. Steve
This
James
is
is doing
Dr.
it.
Steve James, yeah. So if you Google him, there was an article that came out about him in the Independent 2 days ago, and as soon as I saw it, I was like, of course, he has a side business where he's selling people dreams for £500 an hour. Why wouldn't he have that? Like,
Yeah.
and I'm not saying that everyone who has concerns about taking a vaccine, and you've done work with AstraZeneca. We'll talk about blood clots and stuff in just a second, but I'm not talking about anyone who's had concerns about taking a vaccine or people who are fucking scared of taking a vaccine because of this bullshit. I'm not having a go at these people, but these fucking assholes who are out there selling £500 an hour treatment at private clinics and talking about buy my supplements like on some Alex Jones bullshit. Like, honestly, they're grifters. How can these people
Completely.
not see that they're grifters? Yeadon, people like that, that Kate Shamarani, like these people are psychotic arseholes who are in it to make a bit of money. And case in point was Piers Corbyn. Now, I was a fan of Jeremy Corbyn. I'm a bit of a socialist. I'm a bit of a lefty, right? Piers Corbyn, scum of the earth. And the video that came out, and you probably saw it and got a laugh out of it, was those pranksters who also got Katie Hopkins to accept a cunt award. They met up with Piers Corbyn in Sloane Square and they
Yeah.
filmed themselves saying that they were from AstraZeneca and we're going to give you 10 grand to basically shut up about AstraZeneca. Go as hard as you want at Pfizer and Moderna, but leave AstraZeneca alone.
Yeah, I remember seeing that.
He took the money, or what he thought was the money. It was actually an envelope full of paper, but he took it. How anybody can still share anything that man says, any cause he's still a part of, when they are all about the cash, it's embarrassing. Like,
I mean, maybe he's a big fan of Monopoly because he had like so much Monopoly money he could have just had it stashed in his pocket, always winning the game. But exactly, it all boils down to money at the end of the day. And to be honest, I don't think Piers Corbyn's very well.
No, I don't either, to be honest.
He doesn't seem well at all. But then people like Yeadon, I think there's a kind of scale. Yeadon is one of the worst. I mean, his misinformation is so ridiculous that I cannot understand why people would even still follow him. You look back on what he said, and now look at what's happened. Yeah. Reality itself has proven him to be such an idiot.
Yeah,
and he's still going. He's still going, and it's just like, when do people just stop giving this idiot airtime?
And I think that's the problem. I think he creates hits on YouTube, much like, there's a reason that I used to really enjoy Joe Rogan's podcast. And if he has MMA guys on it, I'm a big UFC fan. I've actually got an MMA review coming out on this podcast, the episode after this. There's, like loads of great episodes he's done with comedians. I've seen most of the comedians in his friend group: Bert Kreischer, Tom Segura, Bill Burr. These are fantastic guests. They're always a good laugh. Yeah, they're always a good laugh. The MMA shows are great. But it's really noticeable to me that since he's had this Spotify deal and all of his stuff's exclusively on Spotify, he has been getting some of the big, and he's always had arseholes on, like your likes of your Alex Joneses and people like that. But he has been getting some of the biggest grifters and bullshitters imaginable on his podcast talking about COVID. I actually had to there was, I think Osterholm was on there originally.
Yeah, that was a very good one. And I think the other one, Peter Hotez as well.
Yeah, so they were really good. And I listened to another one during the pandemic, which was Tom O'Neill, who spoke about conspiracy behind Marilyn Manson being enacted into MK Ultra and brainwashed and stuff in the 60s. That stuff like that was really, really interesting. And a lot of it steeped in fact. But the last couple of years during this pandemic, oh my God, I think as much as I was a big fan of him, like he's so irresponsible with some of these guests that he's been having on. And the British media, rather than having, no one knows the names. And I'm embarrassed because I've left the book downstairs and I've forgotten. There's Sarah Gilbert and then there's the other woman that wrote Vaxxers. No one sees these people in mainstream media. No one knows who they are. And when the people are in the mainstream media who've been doing this shit for years, like Professor Chris Whitty, who's a fucking genius, Jonathan Van Tam, who, big him up, he stepped down today and he's going back to just being a tutor. Like people like that who have been in the game for years and know exactly what they're talking about. People are talking about like hanging them in the street and shit. And it's like,
it's shocking.
What world are we living in, man?
There was something funny actually just on this subject. Last Wimbledon last summer, I remember seeing the crowd in Wimbledon. I think we were on centre court, and Sarah Gilbert was in the crowd, and they all gave her a standing ovation. And then on walked Novak Djokovic. And I just at the time, I don't know many people knew that he was an anti-vaxxer at that point. I just thought, I wonder what he's going through his head right now. The woman's just got a standing ovation, and you're walking out being this well-known anti-vaxxer in the tennis world. And I just thought, that's just an example of where society's at the moment. You've got in the same stadium, she's come to watch someone who's probably, against what she's doing.
Terrible guy. And it's interesting, I just saw a tweet a little while ago that if it had been Serena Williams or Naomi Osaka, two women of color that have been behaving the way Novak Djokovic has been behaving the last couple of days, they would not be off of the front pages. But a lot of people aren't saying dog shit about him, and part of it is like a real privilege thing. But that's a conversation for another day. But I think it's something that people really need to pay attention to, because Naomi Osaka, for one, was dragged by her hair through the media for having the audacity to take time off for her mental health. Yet this dickhead is breaking laws, visiting people whilst COVID positive, traveling internationally, not doing as is required. Even if he did have COVID and he is now, immune for a time, which, something else we can discuss briefly. His behavior is just egregious, man. He's just an arsehole. But this is the thing. We're lauding absolute dickheads at the minute. I say we, just some people in society are lauding dickheads and putting people down. Now, as I say, I'm very pro-vax. My missus works in the NHS. She's very pro-vax. She got her jab super early. I volunteered at a vaccination centre. I got my jab super early. Pfizer in the end. But in terms of people's actual fears, I understand that there are a lot of actual fears out there. A lot of people would rather get COVID than have vaccines until they get COVID. Then they realize, for the most part, I never want to have it again. I know that much. It was terrifying.
I didn't enjoy Delta, no.
Nah, I had the original before the remix. So, mate, it was just like the weirdest feeling. It wasn't like I didn't necessarily feel that ill, but trying to stand up, I just couldn't breathe. It's insane. But people are scared, people are worried. And one of the things that did come out that, has weight, has legitimacy, but only like a 0.3% legitimacy, was the risk of blood clots. Now, I don't know how much you can tell me about what that risk was and how much it relates in comparison to the actual risk of blood clots from COVID, which is pretty high. But what was the deal with that and the Astrazeneca vaccine? And, they took it away from people under the age of 40 and gave everyone Pfizer just to mitigate that tiny bit of risk, which, by the way, they wouldn't have done if they wanted to kill you all.
This is important because so you've got I'll go to where this all comes from. So you've got the VAERS database in America, which is the vaccine adverse reporting system, and over here you've got the yellow card database. And what happens there is, following vaccination, anybody can report to those systems. So first of all, because we're in a pandemic and we're all being vaccinated all at once, billions of jabs are being given out. These databases are going to have a lot more traffic than ever before anyway. But the thing is about these, they're completely unverified accounts, and they can be reported to by anybody. Then they have to be systematically reviewed by experts in order to mine them appropriately. And these reporting sites, the yellow card system, is where they were able to actually detect these very low levels, these very rare occurrences that were slightly above base level of myocarditis and the blood clotting. And I think the blood clotting was extremely rare, the actual blood clotting type that was happening with those vaccines. It was, I think it's around 1 or 2 per million. And they've actually recently discovered what the mechanism was. And whatever people say who support Malone, it has absolutely nothing to do with circulating spike protein. It's quite a sort of a rare mechanism that occurs. So they've not only identified that early on that there was an exceptionally rare occurrence, and you'll have heard many comparisons that it was significantly less than blood clotting associated with the contraceptive pill, yes, or taking a long haul flight, significantly lower than that.
So to do my layman's terms bit, that means you are more likely to suffer blood clots and serious consequences from them if you are a woman taking the contraceptive pill or going on a long haul flight.
Yeah, I think I mean, not to scare people. I mean, these are, it's still rare side effects, but I think it's 1 in a few thousand is the risk of a blood clot associated with contraceptive pills, where you're talking 1 or 2 per million in the Astrazeneca vaccine. And I've always tried to tell people that you would never get that in a clinical trial. You have to have vaccinated millions of people before the exceptionally rare side effects start occurring.
Yep.
And also, they all seem to be happening at once because we're all being vaccinated in a very short period of time. So if you vaccinate a billion people in 6 months, then any exceptionally rare side effects are all happening in 6 months.
Yeah.
So, it's all about perspective and probabilities.
Yeah, and I think that's something that people miss as well. It's remarkable. It really is remarkable. Just how much people are just willing to look over for their own bias. And it's weird because I want to say their own biases because normally that's something that proves them right, but they're almost scaring themselves a lot of the time.
Yeah, I mean, confirmation bias is a big problem especially with the conspiracy theories, because there's the side to how susceptible someone is for various reasons, but you've also unfortunately got the algorithms behind social media platforms. We all know that if you go on YouTube and you'll sort of spend watching a certain couple of videos, like, say for example, you're into talk radio, you can keep getting served up talk radio episodes every time you go on there. If you listen to certain music, say like defected playlists, you'll get loads of defected records coming up in your suggested list. If you're a conspiracy theorist, that is literally an algorithm that's doing the confirmation bias for you. So you're stuck in a rut then if you don't know any better.
My favorite algorithm at the moment is actually TikTok. And the reason I say that is because I started watching on TikTok. I randomly stumbled across one guy who was breaking down conspiracy theories and he was debunking people like Robert Malone. And ever since I watched him and a couple of his other videos, my entire TikTok newsfeed now is either gym, cooking, or people debunking conspiracy theories. It's the fucking greatest app in the world. I'm just amazed by it. It's the only one I've still got on my phone.
Yeah, exactly. It's blindly just serving up what you're interested in. But if all you're interested in is 9/11 conspiracies and all that kind of stuff, you'll end up it leads you all the way to QAnon and everything else.
Which is the QAnon stuff is absolutely terrifying, but it's also fucking hilarious. I've been watching this guy, Jordan Klemper, who does the Daily Show in the States with Trevor Noah, and he goes to a lot of these anti-vax rallies, and he interviewed this one woman, and she was like proper anti-vax, like she was going crazy about it, but she was pro-Trump, and he said to her, "Oh, like, don't you think Trump deserves credit for what he's done with the vaccine?" And she was like, but why? And he was like, "Oh, he got it done faster than anyone else, and he threw all this money at it, and he got the vaccines there, and he's a really big success with the vaccine. Yay, Trump!" And she was like, you could tell she wanted to be, yeah, Trump, my hero, but she couldn't because of this fucking nonsense that she'd been fed about vaccines. Exactly. His own base have gone bananas because he said that he's had the booster.
But they will do. I mean, QAnon started to collapse after the election was clearly lost. And it did start to implode a little bit. And I think I watched a documentary recently where a young guy went into America and was brazenly interviewing some of the main people in QAnon, and he was getting they were getting very aggressive with him.
Yeah.
But I thought it was brilliant. And what he even had a conversation with someone who was convinced that Michelle Obama was a man. And he was literally saying to him, he was like, you do realize how absolutely ridiculous you sound. But they will literally, everything that's associated with all these silly conspiracies, they'll lap it all up. And they're the least skeptical people. They say they're skeptical, but they're the least skeptical people because they'll just lap any nonsense.
Yeah, anything. It's a weird thing that there's plenty of people out there, as I say, that are scared because of some of the stuff that they've seen, because of these other people sharing it a lot of the time. They're also there's a big thing that I think needs to be mentioned as well within certain communities with different ethnicities and nationalities where people have been experimented on, and there's been a lot of egregious shit done to people over the years, even just in terms of medical, quotes unquote, medical discovery. We know that it was probably a bit more sadistic than that, but so there's a lot of vaccine skepticism in certain communities, and it's understandable to a certain degree, but again, that comes back to privilege. Like, you're white and you live in the West, like, shut the fuck up.
Yeah,
poor you with all of this great medicine that you've got. it's there's people that are scared, but then there are people that are just literally looking to be part of a crowd, and they want to
Yeah.
feel like they're special, and they want to march up and down Park Lane with their placards and
Yeah.
my body, my choice, and all of this other shit. Which brings me on to the mandates and stuff. And I know you, and it's really interesting because you're someone who works within the music industry, and you mentioned at the top of the show that there is a divide among people with opinions about this kind of stuff. You're someone who has spoken out against vaccine passports, and I remember reading
Yeah.
your statuses and actually agreeing with you. And we'll get into other mandates and stuff with regards to the NHS, but vaccine passports is an interesting one because at first glance, I'm like, yeah, why shouldn't you prove something when you go into a venue? But then the immediate thought in your head is, well, actually, the better thing to do wouldn't necessarily be for the vaccine. It would actually be for being negative of COVID, right? If that's what we're really trying to stop the spread. Talk me through your thoughts behind vaccine passports and why they're probably a stupid idea.
Yeah, I mean, this goes back to when we were first discussed. I did do a post on this where I thought that we obviously coercing young people to get vaccinated just so for the reason of being able to go to a nightclub rather than, for the right reasons of protecting themselves and others. And people can shout, "Oh, it doesn't stop you getting it, doesn't stop you passing it on." Well, it does to a decent percentage. It's not zero; it's around about 65%, and that's even with an Omicron with a booster. So it's far better to have been vaccinated than not for both those directions. But in terms of forcing people, I've always thought, they just haven't done a good enough job of tackling misinformation, and that would have been far better. All this stuff has just been allowed to circulate, and I mean, the government have been absolutely appalling. But there just hasn't been enough sort of mainstream debunking, if you like, on the news or wherever people are consuming most of their information. And unfortunately, social media, the vast majority of the information in there is just awash with misinformation. The actual scientific accurate information is drowned out by it all. So I don't think people should be coerced into forcing people to be vaccinated like they've done in certain countries where you can't do anything unless you're vaccinated. Because we're coming out of pandemic now, thankfully, but during the pandemic phases where things were really, really bad, we had to have these restrictions. We had to get as many people vaccinated as possible. But as time goes on, it's going to become like flu. You'll have the choice to be vaccinated seasonally or not. It'll just join the circulating viruses that we have. Hopefully, it will become milder and milder over time, and it will just be another thing you can be vaccinated for by choice. I don't see it being this idea that this great reset, we're going to be permanently monitored, and you have to be permanently showing that you're vaccinated in everything you do. It's just the phase we're in is why there's these ideas and concerns.
So as someone who's worked for and with AstraZeneca, you mean you haven't got a database on your computer of everyone's microchip from their vaccine? So you can't tell what they're all doing?
Yeah. Well, that's a really good point because I never made a post about this, but I just thought you could turn up on the day and get vaccinated just by queuing.
Yep.
You can make an appointment, yeah, sure, but lots of people just turn up on the day. It's like, how on earth would they have known who they were putting the vaccine in? You can't just have these loads of just, there's humans in this area milling around. You're not learning anything from that. There's no personalized information there in the actual vaccine. It just makes no sense at all.
Do you know what's really interesting is people talk about nano chips and they're tagging your system and they know where you are at all times. Do you know what's really, really funny about the society that we live in today? The place that they read that information was on one of these. And this is, for those who are just listening, I'm holding up a mobile phone, a smartphone, in fact, that has God knows how many ways of tracking exactly where you are at any given time, to the point where to even fight against the system at this point is such bullshit. That the argument people have with my freedom, listen, do you pay tax? Do you have a bank account? Do you have a job? If the answer to any of those three questions is yes, you are in the system. You have no freedom. Shut the fuck up and get on with your life. Get a jab and don't be such a baby.
Yeah, it's just stupid. It's like people posting these memes saying, I have my freedom, you're not chipping my vaccine, you're not chipping me, you're not surveilling me. And then the next post is, oh, I'm just sat in Nando's in South Woodford, I'm having a burger and chips. And you're just like, what the fuck?
Yeah, people who share every detail of their lives and tag themselves on Instagram are suddenly really, really opposed to having their freedom taken away from them. It's mad. I've never in my life have I seen such nonsense. But parts of it where, you know, I think things that haven't helped are the stupid restrictions. Like we've had, I don't want to use the phrase pro lockdown because I hated it and we all hated it.
Yeah.
And it was crap and it did destroy a lot of people's businesses, particularly in the industry that we love. A lot of people have really struggled. It's been horrible for people's mental well-being. We're going to be suffering the after effects for quite a long time, I think,
Yeah.
and it's affected children in certain ways and stuff like that. We know that there are a lot of negatives. However, as a man of science, how bad do you think it would have got in terms of hospitalizations and deaths had we done nothing?
It's quite scary to think because there's places that weren't able to do a lot, and you see how they fared, like Brazil and India at times, where it really was. Because what happens is, I mean, you'll have seen this before Christmas as well. There was no official lockdown, but people's behaviour changed anyway.
Yeah.
So that's what you'll have found in March, early March. People's behaviour started to change, and there was no lockdown at that point. There wasn't even an expectation at early March. I think that there was, the government seemed to be going a different direction.
I was shaking hands with everybody here.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, I think I've just Alexa, stop. I don't know why that happened, but Alexa started talking to me.
She heard the Boris Johnson impression kicked off, I think.
Yeah, she's pro-government by the sounds of it.
She probably thinks it's a fucking garden party.
Yeah, that was weird. Sorry, I've lost my way. Where were we?
It's Bill Gates, mate.
Yeah, I'm being controlled to say certain things now.
Yeah, we're talking about behavioural patterns in March, and it's interesting because I work in a public building. I won't say where on air. I'll tell you after because it's it's a place of research. Just put it that way. But we noticed that our clients and customer base was just like way down, like just in the first week of March.
Yeah, so we locked down. I think 23rd of March, and if people look at the death tolls in April 2020. We had 88,000 people die in total, all-cause mortality. And if you look back several years into the past, the death rate of April was around about 40,000. So it was more than double the normal usual amount of deaths.
Yep.
So you had a big signal there. And that was throughout April. So, we'd locked down too late. And also there was no other explanation for why that number was so high. If we'd not done anything, the hospitals would have been completely overwhelmed. And you've got something called surge capacity in the ICU wards.
Yep.
Yes, you have plenty of beds in hospitals, but you also have the ICU wards and the ventilator capacity that we have. And you've also got the normal care that takes place in hospitals as well. If it's not just flooding those beds and reaching surge capacity quickly, you've also got infection control. That's why the other wards were much more quiet. People avoided hospitals. You would have just had hospitals overwhelmed and people not just dying of COVID, dying of everything else because they couldn't get into the hospitals.
Yeah.
And it would have just been a complete mess. So by doing nothing, it wouldn't have been.
I think the confusion has come from that was the model at the beginning. That was what we were facing if we did nothing. And I think the fact that didn't ever happen, or it kind of did in some parts of the country, it was really, really bad. I mean, as I say, my missus works in critical care. She's in ICU every fucking day.
Yeah.
Like I heard stories pre-pandemic, knowing they knew what was coming. They did their absolute best to prepare. And, it was bad enough with the restrictions. And I think this is what people fail to realize in the difference between what could have happened if we had done nothing and what did happen. Because the fact is yes, we locked down too late and things were bad anyway, but Christ, they would have been so much worse had we not. Much like, yes, we are still seeing X amount of cases and deaths every day. And that's something that we are it's going to get better, but eventually it's going to get to a level kind of like where we were in the summer of last year, where we can live with it quite easily. But had we not had vaccinations, You guys have no fucking idea. Had Omicron come along with its 200,000 cases a day, it would have probably been at least 3 times that without vaccination.
Yeah.
Deaths would have gone way back up without vaccination. Even with a milder strain, we know that would have happened. So,
well, yeah, that's the thing about Omicron is it's intrinsically potentially slightly less milder, but the reason it's not had the same impact as we were worrying about is because of the widespread immunity in those age groups. There's a very subtle increase in children with Omicron getting hospitalised, as opposed to what the rate was per 100 cases on the other variants. This is just spreading so quickly, and it's spreading through obviously that portion of society which is completely unvaccinated. So intrinsically, we're not sure how different this is, but there is evidence that it's upper airways rather than getting into your lungs. But with the lockdown, if, as everyone knows, we've genetically proven that the amount of introductions mid-March 2020 of how much the virus was coming in was huge when we weren't locked down, and all those hospitalizations and deaths were burnt in then. There was nothing you could do to stop them.
yeah.
If we'd just taken influence from what was happening in Italy and done something earlier, we could have significantly reduced that curve. And the idea of flattening the curve is to push cases into the future where treatments are better, knowledge is better, and potential vaccines are available.
Yeah, it's interesting. I remember we went to Budapest just before. We were in Budapest in February, and we were coming back, and there was quite a lot of Asian tourists on our flight, and every single one of them already had a mask on. It was like they fucking knew, like, because they've dealt with SARS and they've dealt with other viruses as well. And when we, interestingly enough, we actually went to Lombardy after the first restrictions had lifted in August of 2020, and they were taking mask wearing and sanitizing and temperature checks at doors so much more. I mean,
They were
August
hit very
2020
hard.
over here, yeah.
Yeah.
August 2020 over here was a shit show. I mean, as I say, I work in a public building and I had to do a lot of health and safety planning during the lockdowns, and I'm in charge of quite a big team and stuff. So, you know, in terms of restrictions that we had, I remember us being like, well, we kind of need to make it a requirement for people to wear masks to come in here. And it's like, yeah, but it's not the law and blah, blah, blah. 2 days later, I was in Italy and I tried to walk into a pizza place and I didn't have a mask on. The woman was like, get out, get out, get out. And I was like, whoa, like, but fair enough, you know?
It's very different in some of these other places like Sweden. People keep using that as an excuse, but I think the population was just a lot more sensible. They did take precautions. They did work from home.
Yep.
They didn't intermingle. There was no official right. You cannot do this and this and this, but they were just following these guidelines anyway, to an extent. So you know.
Yeah, big behavioral changes. Also, some of the other things that I found quite interesting during the pandemic was with comparisons with other countries. I mean, if we're going to directly compare the UK to any country not in Europe, the only one I think we can realistically compare it to in terms of population density and size is probably South Korea, who've had a much better pandemic than we have. When people talk about things like Australia and New Zealand, for example, I've got a lot of friends and family in Australia, and all these people say to me, it's horrendous the way they've treated their people. Rah, rah, rah. And I talk to my friends who live in Melbourne, in Victoria, which is like the worst affected place in terms of restrictions. And I spoke to one friend the other night, and she was like, no, it ain't that bad. And I was like, she's like, it's not been, she said, you know what? The cases are spiking right now and people are scared and our vaccination rate is not great. And yes, the restrictions have been tough. But then she said to me, but we've had less deaths in this entire pandemic than you lot had in a month.
Yeah.
And it's like, do people not realize that at some point these restrictions have actually worked? And this whole thing about, you know, and this is virology aside, this whole thing about lockdowns didn't work is such a crock of shit. It's such really bullshit. The entire aim of lockdown was to stop us getting to a position where people were dying on the pavement outside Guy's and Tom's hospitals because they could not get in. And we achieved that together as a society. It's something we should be proud of. Yes, it has negatives. Yes, we have to deal with the after effect. But again, it's part of the anti-vax stuff of just like, you know, and I think a big problem is, and you've alluded to this a few times on your social media, a lot of the problem with it is people were locked down, they're stuck indoors, they're stuck on YouTube, and they turn into fucking lunatics.
Yeah, especially if, you know, it's horrible that people were, I mean, yes, people were furloughed and maintained some earning throughout, but then there was people who lost the jobs outright, and they were spending 18 hours a day on YouTube and just being, you can completely understand how someone vulnerable would, and angry as well, extremely angry and bitter. You lack control, you don't know what's going on, and conspiracy theories are quite a comforting thing for people to give them an idea that there's some agent involved.
Yeah, as I say, I mean, it's people thinking that they're part of something. Like it's a comfort thing.
Tribalism, yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. Just before I started this podcast, I was on a friend's podcast. Shouts out to Paul S. He was very skeptical about everything, and you know, we spoke very. I'm talking like it was probably about a year ago. So we're about a year into the pandemic. It was during the main winter lockdown, and I said to him, I said, I think the biggest thing that the biggest problem people have faced, and I don't know if you'd agree with this, but I think people have a real hard time accepting the fragility of reality. I don't think that people can quite grasp the concept that we are essentially little beings on a tiny planet and it could all like that in a second. Anyone who's watched Don't Look Up, like you have no idea how hard it is to grasp just how fragile you are with our own ego, our own life, what we've built for ourselves, everything that we own, all of the accomplishments, science, like everything that we've done has been amazing. And people can't accept that there's at some point, and this wasn't it, but at some point there could very well be a virus that pops up and we are finished, and we're talking Walking Dead levels of finished by tomorrow. Like
it's a bit major contradiction in a lot of these conspiracy theories is that they wax lyrical about how useless the government are, how useless the scientists are, how crap they are, and the fringe people need to be listened to. Yet they're absolutely convinced that there's this big plan in place which would require the most immaculate planning and secrecy between millions and millions of very different people from very different political ideologies as well in different countries. Yep. The most strict place that's reacted in terms of restrictions and taking it so seriously out of every country in the world is by far China. They quarantine people. They didn't just give them, right, you must stay at home, blah, blah, blah. They quarantined 11 million people in Wuhan. They have a couple of cases recently. They shut down the whole city. It's just like, that they are completely different politically to we are, and they're not going to be in cahoots with us. They're kind of in the idea of this pandemic, where it originated from. They're in loggerheads with us.
I don't know if you want to touch on it, and we can pause and skip this bit. But as a scientist, the whole China thing, and I want to preface this by saying anything that we do say is not against Chinese people, but I think we all know that the people in charge of China are some dodgy motherfuckers. In whatever sense you want to look at it, just in terms of world politics, they're very. There's some serious shit going on with these people. I mean, even today as we record, this podcast is going to drop next week, but today as we record, we've just found out that a member of the Chinese Communist Party has infiltrated the UK government and has been financing MPs within the UK. That's breaking news this evening. So we know that there's some shit that goes on with them, with Russia, and don't get me wrong, UK government and US government twisted as well. But in terms of China and the lab leak theories and stuff like that, as someone who understands this stuff a lot better than most, what are you thinking?
So there's the media, and what's gone out in the media is swung from one side to the other. It started off obviously being very much it's the natural zoonosis, and then it's now swung all the way. The media I'm talking about swung all the way to just being basically the lab leak stuff. When in reality, there's evidence for both sides. And to quickly break down what the thoughts are around this, the extreme conspiracy end is that it's a bioweapon, which is nonsense. There's so many reasons for why that's not true. And then the other end of the scale is, say a researcher from the Wuhan lab had gone out into the field, collected some samples, or got infected at that site, or brought something back and got infected in the lab. And then in the middle kind of ground is the gain of function experiments, where they were we know they were doing these gain of function experiments, but something like that has ended up, say, going into research. But there's lots of reasons from either side. The natural zoonosis, again, the similarities between this and SARS-1 are really quite amazing in terms of there was a wet market in a major city. SARS was Guangdong, this one's Wuhan. the main whistleblower scientist who was working on it died of the disease that happened with SARS as well. And these wet markets were both implicated. So there's an absolute certainty that the Huanan seafood market was implicated in this outbreak very early on. Whether it was an amplification event where the actual index case was from somewhere else, the lab or somewhere else, that seafood market was absolutely instrumental in amplifying what was going on. And whether it emerged from that market from an animal is still yet to be seen. There's a very strong point for the natural zoonosis side in terms of they were able to get positive samples and serology positive samples from the ground of that wet market. And that was where animals were being traded, live animals were being slaughtered. That's very hard to do unless you've got a virus in the animals in the market. It's a very difficult thing to be able to get. So either way, whatever direction it took, animals were absolutely involved in testing, in being positive at that market. So there's a lot we can talk about from both sides, but there's no clear-cut answer to this. I'd sway towards the natural zoonosis theory. But again, the media don't represent what's known on that side. It's the clickbait stuff for the lab leak. It's a lot more, appealing almost to people because it's the idea that it's nefarious. But yeah, there's no evidence that's absolutely clear cut on either side yet.
Yeah, I think the idea of a bioweapon's a bit stupid because, I mean, what do? You wipe out half of the world's economy and half of the world, and you're this giant manufacturer that sells goods to the entire planet. How are you going to do that if everyone's broke and everyone's dead? It just doesn't make any sense. It's like Bill Burr said something really, really funny when he was on Conan O'Brien a few weeks ago, and he was talking about, are you vaccinated? And Bill Burr was like, yeah, of course I'm vaccinated. He says, what do you think about conspiracy theories? He said, well, it's bullshit. He says, because if they were going to kill everyone with a vaccine, like they wouldn't want to kill the sheeple that are going to work, that are going to do that are going to dig their ditches for them and build their skyscrapers. They're going to want to kill these really smart Fonzie motherfuckers who, hit a jukebox and it turns on first time because they're so fucking wonderful, and that's the point. They're not gonna depopulate the earth and kill everyone. All of the worker bees, everyone who does all of this work, like they're coming for you. So do you know what? By all means, don't have your vaccine and get wiped out, and just let us sheep all crack on with living life. But I think the bioweapon thing's nonsense, but it does make a lot more sense to talk about it going through animals, as you say, SARS, MERS as well. You mentioned the camels and stuff it was transmitting via. I think Ebola was from bushmeat in rural Africa and stuff like that. A lot of the majority of these viruses over the years have literally come from, it's jumped from animals to humans. We know that loads of animals carry viruses. Koalas famously all have chlamydia. Like it's one of them things, it's like it just happens, and every now and again it jumps to humans. So yeah, I mean, I'm kind of on board with you, and everything I've ever looked up and read, it's just like, as I say, I'm very skeptical of the authorities in China, but I'm also very skeptical of like mixing all of these different rare exotic animals like pangolins and everything else at wet markets.
Absolutely, when they're far more, the idea of having those different animals bleeding and shitting on each other in horrible conditions, you've got a really dodgy, unregulated virus creating lab there in itself. But they've even discovered in Laos, they've discovered bat coronaviruses in the bat species around there that are even more similar now to SARS-CoV-2. They've even started to see very similar, I don't know if you've heard of the furin cleavage site. They've started to see literally only a couple of mutations away from having a natural evidence of furin cleavage site, because that was always this big, almost smoking gun that it was a lab-based thing. But they now start to see very closely related things in nature. So I think the problem is, it goes back to your first point about the Chinese government. It's been so lacking in transparency.
Yeah.
There's so much data that we'll probably never see or probably never be able to take account of, such as testing animals, testing the animal traders. They were able to do that fairly quickly with SARS. And it's 2 years on now. This stuff we probably might never actually find out, unfortunately.
Mate, we can't tell whether or not, I live in Westminster and we can't tell whether my local neighbour or Bojo had a party in his garden. I don't know how the fuck we're supposed to tell where the virus came from, you know what I mean? It was just clueless, I didn't even know I was at a
So
party. So
I didn't even know I was in a gain of function lab. Oh shit, I'm infected.
yeah. So yeah, I mean, going back to mandates and stuff like that. One of the things I did want to touch on and get your opinion on was the mandate for NHS staff, and obviously it's a subject that's quite close to my heart. My missus works in the NHS. My dad was actually in a coma in 2020 on a ventilator himself. Like I spent a lot of time in hospitals and ICUs during the year, and then obviously dealing with the stuff at home, the after effects of having someone work in that industry. So it's an institution that I hold really, really dear to my heart, and I hate the way it's been treated, and I hate, honestly, if there's anyone watching or listening to this podcast who says disparaging things about nurses who were dancing on TikTok during their lunch breaks during COVID, jump up your own arse and die, quite honestly, because if people who are dealing on essentially a war footing minus the guns and bombs can't take a break and have fun with their colleagues,
I know, and it's
what planet do
ridiculous.
we live
Those
on?
people have really, really poisoned the minds with stuff they've been reading
And
to a
so,
point where they say stuff like that.
yeah, and some of the stuff about they're taking people into the hospitals to kill them to bump up the numbers for COVID. It's just like, first of all, COVID isn't real. Then they're inflating the numbers. Then they're murdering people in hospital to inflate the number. It's just like some of the egregious shit I've seen regarding the NHS and these conspiracy lunatics is just, it makes me sick to my stomach.
Yeah, man,
With that being
absolutely.
said, the dickhead doctor who's got his breathlessness clinic, he argued against a vaccine mandate for NHS staff, and this is something that I cannot. In life, you're not supposed to have an opinion on everything, right? But this is something I cannot sit right with on either side, because I can't fathom that there are people that work in healthcare that aren't, unless it's an allergy exemption, which is fine, like, and a lot of the people who do have allergic exemptions, you will discover they actually really want to get vaccinated, and they're usually quite bummed out that they can't. So the people that say that they're exempt, a lot of the time, come on, mate. But apart from those people who can't get it and may have health risks associated with it, it bugs me that there's people that work within the health industry that don't want to get vaccinated. But at the same time, and I wouldn't really want my elderly gran to be treated by someone who was unvaccinated. Yes, we know they could still get and transmit the virus with a vaccine, but as we have discussed in this podcast, it is 65% at least less likely to happen. So I would much rather they boost their chances by 65% of not killing my nan,
Yeah,
than anything else. But it doesn't sit right with me that people are being forced to do something or lose their job. However, I do think that they are forced to have the hepatitis vaccines. And there are other vaccines that people are forced to have when we travel and stuff. Yellow fever and stuff has always been a big one. There are vaccine mandates for other things. So I'm trying to open my horizons, and I won't. I'll tell you my missus's opinion off air because you'll laugh. But like, I've tried to listen to everything, and I've tried to form some kind of feeling of comfort with this. And I wanted to get an actual sort of expert's opinion on it. How are you feeling about the idea behind vaccine mandates? With the caveat that we also have to bear in mind that the NHS is not in a position where it can afford to lose staff at any level right now.
yeah.
And if staff are going to be fired in April for not being vaccinated, it's going to be a big problem. So what are your thoughts and feelings on a vaccine mandate for NHS staff?
Well, it's a difficult one because it comes off the back of the care home workers and the fact that they were advised and almost a risk of losing their positions if they weren't vaccinated. It is a very difficult one because I think a lot of the fears are coming from misinformation. But then, obviously, when you take into account of a medic who, like the one we've discussed, I'm not sure what his stance in terms of what he said. I immediately thought it was a very strange sort of set of reasons he gave because he mentioned Delta and Omicron and the data on immunity waning with those. Now, we already know that data immunity wanes with natural infection as well. But the thing about what he was saying was in terms of backing up the fact that he hadn't been vaccinated at all, which means he was offered it a year ago because remember they were some of the first people to be offered it.
My missus
So
got hers just before Christmas 2020.
Well, there you go. So we're going back a year where they were offered it. And at that point, we were in a massive alpha wave, which was killing about 1,200 to a point where it's 1,600 people dying a day in the hospitals. Yeah. So he's using Delta and Omicron data, which he got wrong, to sort of reason that he'd not been vaccinated at all at that point in time. So that didn't sit well with me at all. It made no real sense to me. It's like, you refused it then, not now. You're not refusing a booster. You've not been vaccinated at all. So he stood out as being someone, I don't understand why he thought it was appropriate to say that, because it's fodder for anti-vaxxers, and that's apparently not what his goal was. But sorry, yeah, going back to the mandating, yeah, it's a very difficult one, because the way I see things now is hopefully we're on our way out of the, we've got the Omicron wave, which seems to have peaked. Hospitalizations are slowly kind of creeping up as they're expected to. But I think as you go on from spring onwards, it's not, flu vaccines aren't mandated, for example. So once we get to a point where it's circulating an endemic, this whole mandating thing won't even be an issue if it does go that way. But at this point in time, if you're dealing with patients and you can prove that you've got antibodies, then obviously there's going to be reasons for maybe not mandating it in those circumstances. But if you don't have antibodies and you're susceptible and you're working with vulnerable patients, doesn't matter that they're vaccinated as well. There's only percentage protection that I've explained. You still have breakthrough cases. I think it's going to have to be a bit more detailed, the examination of whether someone has antibodies, for example, and what their reasons are for not being vaccinated. Just a blind blanket mandating, I don't think is very sensible.
No, neither do I. And I think part of me doesn't, but then also there's the worry that what happens in a couple of months' time when, an unvaccinated doctor is dealing with a COVID positive patient, doesn't know they're a COVID positive patient, catches a really nasty case of COVID and dies. At what point is there issues around liability and things like that? This is all things that we're going to have to look at moving forward within the healthcare service and stuff. So I think, it's a conversation that needs to be ongoing. I don't think this is something that we can rush through by April.
Absolutely.
I hope Javid backtracks on it. But if, the last two health secretaries are anything to go by, they're fucking useless. Jeremy Hunt and Matt Hancock, absolute. I mean, Jeremy Hunt did everything that he could over the course of 10 years to just dismantle the NHS. And Matt Hancock, top shagger, just spreading his own variants wherever he went. It just absolutely, oh yeah, absolute embarrassment of a man. But again, I think things like his behavior have really, really fed into this whole do not comply stuff when it comes to vaccines and masks and I mean, we haven't even touched on masks, but vaccines and restrictions and stuff. I think, more than anything, we can talk about the misinformation and the fact that they haven't done enough. One of the reasons they haven't done enough is because a lot of the same sources that peddle misinformation are the same sources that are used for propaganda for the government in terms of, whichever way you voted is neither here nor there. But in terms of things like Brexit, in terms of general elections and stuff, a lot of the same companies and journalists, client journalists, the same people that will peddle stuff for the likes of Boris Johnson moving forward. And there's that aspect to it, but it's also the incompetence, as you rightly mentioned earlier. How the fuck could we get every single government that doesn't even agree with each other on anything to suddenly have this entire global conspiracy? It's literally a question of incompetence as opposed to some sort of mastermind plan. They just don't, even 2 years into this pandemic, they just do not know what they're doing and refuse to listen to anyone who does.
Yeah, they can't even keep the garden party secret.
It's absurd. So I think that's been a big part of things. And yeah, so I don't know, man. I'm really still uneasy with the NHS mandate. I understand why on face value it's something that they want to happen. And would you want your would you want your cancer-stricken gran to be dealing with an unvaccinated doctor or a vaccinated doctor? Ask yourself that question and ask how you feel about it. And that's something that I've been dealing with, because my gran's going in for surgery next week. So
I think the compliance for vaccines in hospitals is very high. I think it's like averaging around 90%. And I think I know a friend who he's managed to get his hospital to 98%, which is exceptional. But I think there's potential for redeployment. People have been talking about, not obviously people losing the jobs, but redeploying them to not working with vulnerable patients, for example. But I know that will obviously cause problems. So I agree with you. I think it's not a very straightforward answer to this, and it's going to be beneficial to have an ongoing conversation and looking at data specifics and immunity and things like that to nail down what's best.
I wanted to get into a few of your most favorite and stupid conspiracies and moments from the pandemic. But before I did just briefly touch on it there, and we haven't really gone into detail. The biggest bone of contention for a lot of people is masks. Thoughts on masks? And, for me, I'm very pro, partly because I think people are disgusting anyway. Anyone who lives in London and gets on the tube knows that you probably should be wearing a mask at all times anyway. And I even when we didn't have to wear masks, I still wore mine on public transport, because fuck breathing the same air as some of these people. And if you're listening to this and think I'm talking about you, I probably am. But your thoughts on masks and the effectiveness, but also the argument and some of the, I don't want to say stupid, but walking into a place and having to sit down without it on, but then being able to go to the toilet with it on, and the weird stuff like that, which I don't think has helped.
Well, going on that point, your last point there, they obviously started saying that they brought in these Plan B restrictions where you had to wear masks in shops, but you were fine in pubs and restaurants and clubs, which at first face value, you just think that makes no sense at all. But it's really just a kind of allowing some kind of mitigation strategy in areas where it's needed, such as an old person, elderly, vulnerable person cannot avoid going to a shop. You need to protect them. So mask wearing there makes sense, but on nightclubs and places like that, people can take their own risks. They're not essential places to go to. So that kind of explains why that was going on. But just in general, again, people keep digging for all these papers to confirm the biases, saying they absolutely don't work. They cause you CO2 poisoning and all this absolute crap. It's quite a basic concept. It's like people with good manners, and it's always been very basic hygiene to cover your mouth when you cough or sneeze or whatever. A mask is there just to help along, mainly droplet spread, because you know that when you talk to someone, you'll get a bit of spittle on your face occasionally. And with a mask on, that is prevented. Those big droplets are prevented, and they'll contain a lot of virus. Obviously, it doesn't stop the aerosols very well, but it at least mitigates to a point. It's the Swiss cheese approach, if you like. You may have heard. You've got social distancing, you've got the mask wearing, and then you've got other strategies and hand washing, which, as over time, we've realised is probably not as useful as it first was thought. But again, you learn these things about the virus as you go on. But you do all these, and then you bring in vaccinations as well. So you've got all these different layers of protection. And for me, mask wearing is not a problem. It's uncomfortable, but 20 minutes in a shop, an hour on the tube, it's uncomfortable, but it's not a massive issue where you feel like your liberties have been encroached. It's a temporary thing anyway. It's not going to be permanent. And people who've said, oh, I've got asthma, I've got these other breathing conditions where I don't want to wear a mask. I'm like, well, you're in the higher risk category for COVID and complications from that. So you should be more concerned in terms of protecting yourself. So if you absolutely cannot wear a mask, you have to think of other ways of protecting yourself then, by maybe online shopping. I know that was a problem initially, but you should not just be willfully casting aside these things that are there to protect you, especially if you're higher risk, and just going about your day as if everything's fine, because you are at higher risk of the disease itself. So yeah, I had a period of time, I was living in Epping, and it was during that really bad alpha wave where I think there was 1 in 10, 1 in 12 people in that area had COVID, and there was loads of people not wearing masks in the local shops, and I was getting very angry at that point because I just thought, the shops themselves had to stop these people coming in. I know some places did, but they weren't doing in the area I was. I just found it infuriating. It's just like, this is a really bad time. There's a lot of people dying at this point in time, and it's going to get worse. And it invariably, obviously, did. So yeah, I had periods of time where I found it infuriating.
Yeah, for sure. It's interesting because a friend of mine, really good friend of mine, from work, I work in as I say, public sector building. We closed down. A lot of us worked from home. Some people just couldn't, and there was no point in furloughing people. So a lot of people were just off. And a friend of mine whose job is largely based on site, he went down to Kent just before the Christmas restrictions came in. And I technically don't think he was supposed to go, but he lives on his own in a flat in East London, and his whole family live in Kent. And it's like, he has no support bubble, so I'm going to risk it and fuck off. So he went down to Kent over Christmas, stayed down in Canterbury for about 3 months in the end. And yeah, he's like, I spoke to him. I used to speak to him because my missus would work the night shift a lot of the time. And although it was winter and it was pitch black, and lo and behold, a girl did go missing and got killed, I used to go walking on Clapham Common quite a lot at night. I'd walk from where I live in Westminster, I'd walk all the way down through Wandsworth and just to get my exercise. And I like being out at night anyway. Plus, I'm born and bred in South London. If you want to come at me, bro. But I used to ring him up and talk to him for an hour or two on my walks, and we used to catch up about what we'd been up to that week and stuff. And he said to me, mate, this is when the Kent variant had kind of become a big thing. And he was like, this does not surprise me at all. And I was like, what do you mean? He's like, well, I've been down here for a couple of weeks, right? There is not one fucking mask anywhere. He's like, these people are just a law unto themselves. It's like, this one of the most ridiculous places I've ever seen. He's like, I don't want to leave the house. I don't want to go to the shop. Because every time there's just like people that are just walking around, not even like under the nose, like some people were doing, or, maybe like taking it off here or forgetting to put it on, like literally flagrantly, like just walking around like
young people,
don't care.
crazy.
Yeah. And he said to me, it's no surprise that this place has developed its entire own brand of COVID. Because people are just walking around, mouth breathing on each other constantly. And it was like, yeah, it doesn't surprise me at all. Does not surprise me at all, one bit. And yeah, I think for me that the mask issue was, I don't like wearing it. It gives you a bit of dry skin around your eyes and your nose, and it's uncomfortable and it can be a bit gammy. And it's just like, it's not a very nice thing. But I just think to myself, like, honestly, if the worst thing, we're not, you're right, we're not going to be wearing these forever. We know that because last summer when the numbers were so low, we didn't have to wear them anymore.
Exactly.
And if people want to wear them and you're so fucking pro-choice, you anti-vax morons, let people wear the mask if they want to wear the fucking mask. But the bigger point I'm making is, if we look back at this in 2 years' time, and all go, oh, fucking hell, remember when we all wore masks? Stupid dickheads we were. That's the worst that's going to happen. Like,
exactly.
We're not bowing down to our overlords by being polite and not splattering on people's faces. It's just, oh.
I know, it's such a small measure. I mean, people keep comparing it. They're talking about the vaccines when they do this, but also this Control of Society 1984, George Orwell, Nuremberg Code, and all this. It's just like, these people really need to get a grip. They don't understand that book. They don't understand what the Nuremberg trials were actually about.
They've never read 1984. They've never ever even looked into the Nuremberg trials. It's people that spout stuff that they have no idea what it was actually about at all.
No, exactly. And it's just comparing it to Nazism, it's just shockingly ignorant and really quite insulting to people. It's just, what they've been asked to do in a society now, which are incredibly spoiled when you compare it to other places that don't have any vaccines.
Yep.
And we just got spoiled a load of brats, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think that's a big part of it as well, is privilege. It really is. It really is. Before we get into some of our favorite stupid moments of the last 2 years, I didn't make a list, but I probably think of a dozen off the top of my head, and I'm sure you can as well. The one final point, there was something I read on Facebook this evening that just infuriated me. And to be honest, the only reason I even reinstalled Facebook on my phone was to message you today, because I'm just like, I really cannot be dealing with it anymore. Someone I know, and I really quite like him. He's a local guy to my area. He's constantly been on this anti-vax bullshit, and even when he had COVID, he tested positive, told everyone he had COVID, and went out maskless the same day. We're just like complete denial that it even exists. But he's been posting about myocarditis and different athletes and stuff collapsing. Now, the interesting thing, and one of the things that made me really laugh, was there was a guy that went on there who's actually worked. I can't remember exactly where it was. I'd have to send you the entire post because it was quite funny, but he knows a lot about heart conditions. I think he worked in healthcare. And he basically commented and was just like, look, mate, the reality is if you Google, and he screenshotted it in the end and posted it up, like the amount of athletes in FIFA who suffer heart attacks and myocarditis episodes over the course of a year, the numbers at the moment are actually lower than average. Like X amount, say 800 players a year will suffer some kind of heart trouble slash myocarditis. He's like, the numbers are low actually in comparative years. So what are you talking about? And this guy's response was a classic, an absolute classic. He went, well, I don't really look at data and I don't really know much about it, but I just see that more people are having heart attacks and that's why I don't want a vaccine. Like, mate, I'll send you the screenshot. That was almost exactly word for word what he said. And I'm like, this is where we are. This is where we are. You've got someone telling you that this is completely normal. It's just being amplified because it's a topic and it's going to get clicks. And you're sitting there saying, well, I don't actually look at data. You know, it's just like, you know, I don't look both ways when I cross the street. And yeah, and what? It's remarkable. From your perspective as someone who's, you know, quite well versed in science, myocarditis, the realities and the risks from it, because I know that Robert Malone was talking a hell of a lot of shit about this on Rogan's podcast. And one of the TikTok videos that I watched, this guy, I'll send you the link to this dude because he's amazing, but he ripped Malone's stats, quotes unquote, apart. Like he ripped him to pieces. Every single study he quoted, I mean, he goes to town. But your thoughts on myocarditis and any sort of increased risk that we may or may not have seen?
So a lot of these very rare side effects that people are familiar with is not the vaccine itself. It's not the solution itself. It's the immune response. So if someone has a very severe adverse reaction to the immune response they mount against the vaccine, then COVID itself would probably cause them significant damage. And people need to understand that because it's myocarditis, for example, can be caused by many different viruses. It's caused by COVID to a much higher percentage than any rare side effect from a vaccine. The same goes for blood clotting. The amount of problems with blood clotting in COVID patients who've had it severe has been something that doctors have never seen before. They said that they described, I think it's the D-dimer measurements that they've made, which are higher than they've seen in any other type of infection.
I can confirm that my mum's partner actually had a stroke directly after having COVID as well, and they said it was caused by blood clots after having COVID. So
yeah, the strokes have been huge in COVID and blood clotting. So all these very adverse side effects, they're quite abundant in COVID infection itself by significant degrees of magnitude higher. You can get myocarditis from a number of things that are fairly, like, I think even stress can bring on myocarditis. And what we know about in relation to the vaccines is, again, it's an exceptionally rare side effect. It's, you know, a couple per, I'm not sure the exact numbers, but it's maybe a couple per 100,000 or something. I'd need to check the exact ones. But again, it's an extremely low number, and they are mild cases when they are. So I think there is a higher incidence than this very low incidence anyway in young males. But again, there's a lot of transparency from what's been going on. They were very transparent about any of these very rare side effects, and even changed the aspects of the rollout to mitigate against things that were happening 1 or 2 per million. So, I mean, you couldn't be more careful than responding in that way. And again, what you said about the players is it's great that someone broke it down in that way, because that's what's needed. It's just drawing more attention to the condition that they just weren't aware of before. Yeah. And now it's more clickbait because cheap media will we'll run with it. So again, it reminds me of the MMR autism 20 years ago when Andrew Wakefield made all the nonsense there.
What a cunt! Sorry.
Absolutely.
Talk about the original anti-vax grifter, and it is Andrew Wakefield every time. That guy, wow.
But with that, just the idea of autism and the cases of autism, it was just more reported on as well. So it almost had this misapprehension, representing the fact that there was more reporting on something, therefore people just thought that there was this increase because of this particular vaccine.
We have this all the time with even, sorry to interrupt again, but things like knife crime. Oh, why is knife crime so bad? It's like, guys, did any of you grow up in the hood? Because I fucking did. Knife crime's always been bad. Like people were getting stabbed on my estate left, right, and center all the time. Do you know the difference between then and now? We didn't have Twitter and Facebook to talk about it.
Exactly. That's exactly it. You've got to look at the cold hard data and statistics at the end, and that's where you can draw the best conclusions from. You can't really do it any other way. The personal pattern matching that we make and emotional connections to anecdotes and things like that has been rife. People sharing memes and Facebook posts as if it's evidence for the vaccine's been a problem. I mean, it's just not the way you assess the world.
No, it isn't. It's just, I got my degree from the University of Facebook.
Yeah, exactly.
So to summarize, I think, with regards to, blood clots, myocarditis, in comparison to the risk from actually having COVID, it's so much more risky to have COVID than to have the vaccine. Or even again, a risk not quite as risky would be to have COVID with a vaccine. Like you're still less likely to have any kind of issues, than the other way around. So if you've got COVID, you are going to suffer. If you've got COVID and a vaccine, you're going to suffer, but not as bad. But if you have a vaccine, it's not going to give you these conditions. The chances are so slim in comparison to getting them from COVID.
Yeah, exactly.
The risk reward is just like, the balance is way off.
There's evidence supporting that if you've had COVID in the past and then months later you were vaccinated, there's evidence to support that it's been able to combat long COVID symptoms by being vaccinated post infection. So again, it's there's a good reason to, just because you've had it, to get vaccinated, because you may have symptoms of long COVID, and that is rife. Is long
it's
COVID.
Horrible, mate. Honestly, I had so we had COVID in March of 2020. It was really weird the way it happened. So my mum had it very, very early on. We closed at work on the 17th of March because we just took the decision, like, look, our numbers, we had like 25% capacity. People were staying home. No one was coming in. People started getting it. The Imperial College report came out regarding, 250,000 deaths. And we just went, you know what? It's not worth it. The government didn't give us any guidance. Our governing body, which is DCMS, they didn't give us any guidance at all. We just went, fuck it, and closed. That was the very same day my mum rang me and she was like, I'm really sick, I think we've got it. As I say, subsequently they didn't get a test, but subsequently tested positive for antibodies. Her partner had a stroke, so we're 99.9% sure they had it. My missus, I remember going home and she had a really, really bad cough. This was on the 17th, and I was like, oh, this doesn't sound too good. And she'd obviously been in the hospital the whole time, but she felt absolutely fine apart from this whooping cough. And it was like, this is really bizarre. And she felt completely fine. Really, really weird. And we kind of made a collective decision because we live apart. She lives with a flatmate who works in the same hospital. And we kind of said to each other, look, like, what am I going to do? Go and sit at home indoors on my own flat, on my own for the next God knows how many months? Or do I just say, look, I'm probably going to get it at some point anyway. I might as well just get it whilst we're here and just be done with it. And if we die, we die together. Like, it's one of them things. It sounds grim and it sounds over the top, but that's the reality of it. It was either sit at home, risk getting it in Sainsbury's and die on my own at home, if that was going to be the worst case scenario, or at least be with my other half in my final days. So we were like, right, we'll hunker down, we'll be here. She was absolutely fine. The cough kind of went away and she went into work the week of lockdown. So that week of the 23rd or whatever, she was back in work. The final weekend in March slash first weekend of April, she went into work on the Monday and she was like, oh, I feel really groggy, really tired, blah, blah, blah. Went into work on the Tuesday, felt the same. She'd slept all night. She felt terrible. On the Wednesday, I came back to my flat because I had a work meeting. My laptop was here. I was like, right, I need to come back, get a few bits done. And she rang me about 10 in the morning. She was like, yeah, they've sent me home. I just cannot stand up anymore. And it took a couple of days, even as a member of the NHS, because this was very, very early. We still didn't have testing capacity. She was able to get a test after a few days and she was positive. By that point, I started to have pains in my legs. I was like, oh, this isn't very good. And I'm in the flat on my own. So I'm just sitting there like waiting day by day for it to get worse. And eventually I was actually okay. But the biggest problem for me and what was most terrifying was I could sit here and have a conversation with you, no problem. The second I get up and try and walk to the bathroom, I was exhausted. I couldn't breathe. I was sweating. My body was in agony. It was the weirdest experience.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
the reason I go into detail on it is because my symptoms in comparison to a lot of people weren't that bad. And my girlfriend she was actually quite violently sick. She was throwing up a lot of aches and pains. Her cough had completely gone. And she seemed, like it was quite a semi-illness, but it took us at least 3 months to be able to fully breathe in and out again. Like that's how much the long COVID affected us. We went out for a walk in May of 2020, and it was quite a long walk out in Surrey, and we were dying. Like it was
Yeah.
horrendous. Like our lung capacity. I mean, I'm a big guy anyway. Like cardio is not my strong point. I power lift, but like it was impossible to fully take that proper deep breath in for
Yeah.
months upon months upon months. And funnily enough, it didn't clear for me until we went to Italy in August and we were at Lake Como and we were out on the lake and it was like really, really beautiful fresh air in the Alps. And it was like, finally, like it just
Yeah.
finally felt, and mate, I cannot explain to anybody who's had COVID, you'll probably relate, but the long COVID and the effect that it can have on your lungs is just, wow.
I've heard so many people talk about that, and again, it's the impact it's had on people's bodies long afterwards. People who have, athletes who've had this, and you don't even need to have had severe illness. You could have
Yeah.
had quite a mild illness with the infection, but then had
That's what I
this
mean. I
months.
was working online the whole way through when I had it. I was fine, but
Yeah,
just that after effect, man. Jesus.
yeah. Some people, it's months and months that they've had, and some people I've heard that even 6 months before they've even got the taste and smell back.
Yeah, I've heard that as well.
So I mean that again, some people, I think more people know that now, but originally I don't think people realised that that was a
Yeah.
neurological impact. It
Do you
wasn't
know what? You've jogged
nasal.
my memory actually, because the same time that we were sick, my girlfriend's flatmate, she had to go and stay at Abramovich's hotel in Chelsea. Which was close by, and they were giving it to NHS staff to be able to go and stay there. So she had to go and isolate there, and my missus was at home on her own. And it was weird because at the time, the no taste and smell thing wasn't an official symptom, but she was saying the weirdest things happen to me. I can't taste or smell anything, and we were like, really? Like that's bizarre. Do you think you've got it? And she was like, I feel fine, haven't got a cough, no fever, don't feel ill at all. The only symptom she had was the taste and smell, and it was for about 5 days. But
Yeah.
clearly she had COVID, but it's just at that
Yeah,
time
it's
we
such a
didn't
strong
know.
indicator. I mean, it's quite different as well. So when you're bunged up and you can't taste and smell
Yeah.
stuff, it's different. This I've not had it, but when people describe it, it's literally like you can eat a Carolina Reaper chili and
You
not
see
even
people
that.
doing it. People have been doing that
Yeah,
online, just eating entire onions, like not even blinking, like, oh mate.
yeah. So that is significantly different, and it was such a strong indicator. I mean, you could literally self-diagnosis on that alone.
Yeah, I was listening to, funny enough, I did listen to a Rogan episode of Tom Segura, and it was just after he had COVID, and he was like, there were just certain foods, even months after, that would just taste horrendous, stuff that he always
Yeah,
loved, and he couldn't describe and explain why his neuro was doing that. It was just just so bizarre.
yeah. It affects multiple organs, and the brain's one of them. That's why
Yeah.
it's such a different type of virus. It's mad.
And I think that's one of the main causes of death as well. You mentioned the effect on people's organs. I think the immune system fighting too hard actually ends up killing the body, if I'm not mistaken. Like that's one of the
Yeah,
main causes of death.
absolutely. Yeah, I mean that's why such high risk people, some of the highest risk of people with diabetes, autoimmune disorder, and chronic kidney disease, because of the way it affects these multiple different organs. It's and the heart as well. I mean, people have major heart problems with it. So it's just a nasty piece of shit.
What can you say to people that do that whole thing about died of or died with? Because my thing is, when people say, "Oh, but they had diabetes and COVID," but it was obviously the diabetes that killed them, I think to myself, well, I know people in my family and friends that have had diabetes for 20 years,
Exactly.
and they weren't going to die next month. It was never on the cards, but then they got COVID and they died. So, are we not looking at the X factor here, which was the fact that they had fucking COVID? And it's like the argument of, oh well, you know, you can get hit by a bus tomorrow, like, and then they put COVID on the death certificate. It's like, how many fucking people do you know that get hit by buses?
They'd get told they were died of COVID. It doesn't happen.
150,000 people died of COVID. Well, no, they just got hit by a bus and they said it was COVID. Like, what are you fucking?
Yeah. Well, Malone said this, didn't he? Malone made this comparison. He didn't use the bus. He used gunshot to the head. And it is absolute nonsense, and for several reasons. Well, I know we do something slightly different here, but in America, I'm assuming they have a similar system where he was suggesting that if you get a gunshot to the head, but you test positive for COVID within that time frame, it goes down to COVID death. And in America, there's a suggestion that they make more money by doing that. Now, first of all, if they were to do that, which they don't, what would the family say when the death certificate says that they died of COVID? Yeah, hang on a minute, my husband blew his own brains out with a gun or had his head blown off by someone. You're like, he didn't die of COVID, his head was shot off. So it's like, what would the family say in that situation? So that's just ridiculous. But to go into the sort of brief details about what happens in the UK is Public Health England were doing the 28 days. They brought it back from 60 to 28 days. The main reason to do that is the number doesn't have to be absolutely down to the exact number, because they do that for real-time surveillance. And the number corrects itself later because the death certificates take a while to investigate and determine the exact cause of death. And that's what gets reported to the ONS. So,
and newsflash, if you have X amount of excess more deaths, it's going to take longer for that process to happen anyway. So that's going to have a knock-on effect.
Exactly. So you need real-time surveillance to get a rough ballpark figure, so you know what direction the pandemic is moving in, and then you can correct for it later when you analyse the death certificates. They don't just put with COVID or without. There's several bits of clinical information that goes on. You've got different codes as well. So these clinicians aren't just gung-ho, just saying, just put it down as COVID or with COVID or whatever. There's specific details that go on there. And there's a lot of very sort of clear signs that someone died of COVID as well, with what happens to the lungs. So there's a lot more detail, but that goes into the death certificates and gets analysed later. So the whole 28 days thing is, people forget that it was real-time surveillance. They didn't need to be bang on. And it turned out to be very close to the real number. Yeah. Once the ONS got in the numbers.
Yeah, no, it's just something that always makes me laugh when people are like, well, did he die of or did he die with? It's like the man had COVID. He was alive before he had COVID. 2 weeks later, he was dead with COVID. Yeah. So
and just because, like you say, someone has diabetes, type 2, it's like you can live a fairly normal life with type 2 diabetes.
Yeah, quite simply, with modern medicine and stuff. And that'd probably be, kind of what we look at now is I haven't forgotten. I want to run through some of the stupid shit, but in terms of the future and modern medicine and stuff, I know there's been this big furore about ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine and all that kind of shit, but we have got some good antivirals that have popped up and seem to be hitting circulation, which is fantastic, especially in terms of living with COVID. In terms of the short and long-term future over the next couple of years, how effective do you see the antivirals becoming, and what hopes do you have for the next few months and the rest of the year?
Yeah, I think it's been amazing what drugs have been repurposed, ones that actually work, not these magic pills. The repurposing of drugs, and then some of the antivirals. Obviously, remdesivir was a popular at the start. That's not really shown to be that effective, but you have had repurposed things like dexamethasone that have actually shown to clinically that they have an impact on reducing the chances of getting onto a ventilator. And there's new drugs coming out all the time. There's molnupiravir, and there'll be others that will will come along. The thing is, when you're reacting in a pandemic, you're under a stressful situation, and we're learning about a very different virus all the time. As time goes on, the antivirals will become a lot better, and the vaccines will improve. The problem with vaccines isn't this idea that they're making people drop dead and things. It's just this waning vaccine efficacy because of the variants. And the reason there's variants happening so often is because the number of cases. Vaccines are actually reducing cases and reducing severe illness. If you just let it run wild, you're going to get more variants because more bodies to replicate in. So over time, that will get less of a problem as well. So it may be that we don't need to vaccinate as often as we do against flu. Flu's a seasonal one, mutates a lot quicker. But coronaviruses might be, a jab every, say, couple of years potentially, once it calms down and becomes a circulating coronavirus, which we have a handful of already. So, improvements to antivirals will happen, and vaccines will improve as well in terms of, stabilizing against how we manage flu as well. I mean, flu vaccines are brilliant. They just haven't had the attention. Yeah. So this will probably, because of messenger RNA as well, we've completely revolutionized how we work, how we can make vaccines quickly.
Do you think the worst is over?
Yeah, well, I said this before, Omicron hasn't turned out to be as devastating as it could have been. But again, we're in this phase where new variants can emerge and could cause problems and vaccine escape and things like that. So I feel like we are coming out of it now. Things are going to get better, but you've always got to err on the side of caution.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And I think the majority of scientists, sensible scientists, not grifters, have actually said the exact same thing. A lot of the time it's like, look, things are going to improve, but right now we are in a position where, we could fuck it up. So let's try and be sensible where we can, and, get vaccinated, wear masks in crowded places still, especially in the winter. And, let's just ride this out. And I love the phrase, oh, you've got to learn to live with it. You've got to learn to live with it.
Like Ebola.
Yeah. By wearing masks, getting vaccinated, and still taking precautions, we are literally learning to live. That is how you learn to live with it. You don't learn to live with it by ignoring absolutely every piece of decent science and walking around like an idiot. Like,
not if you want luxury in the life, not luxury, not if you want to value human life.
Yeah, exactly. And that's, I think that's the bigger picture, and that's, something to take away. But yeah, speaking of idiots, what have been some of your favorite, most outrageous bullshit claims and quotes and stuff that you've heard or had to bat back in this pandemic? Because, mate, I've heard them all.
Yeah, I've heard many. I mean, there was one particular one that stands out. There was kind of a whole mixture of bullshit coming from one particular guy. I think it was like towards the end of the first year, Kai from, Abode.
Yeah.
Kai did a chat with me, and building up to that live chat we did on Instagram, a guy had contacted or started posting on my wall, I think, and then started messaging me and Kai privately on Messenger. And he was coming out with some really wild kind of crap. And he just said to me, he basically believed the virus didn't exist and that I was going to get done personally for genocide, treason, and murder. And I thought, well, what's the point in bothering with murder if I'm going to get done for genocide?
Yeah, just going to throw shoplifting in at the end for good measure.
Yeah, why not just get done for theft? It's just madness. And then I said to him, look, what was it? He was basically saying that the virus didn't exist. And then he was saying that the Ebola and SARS too was made in a lab. And I said, hang on a minute, mate, you just said it didn't exist.
Yep.
And I'm like, how could they have made it in the lab? And then it was tripping up all the time. But as it turns out, he'd also tried to phone Kai through Messenger, through the call function, tried to ring him. And he started shouting at him down the phone. So Kai told him, like, don't ever fucking call me again, hung up, blocked him. And I don't know if you know, there was a hospital in Surrey. This happened a few months later. A guy stormed into the hospital without wearing a mask with his family, tried to drag his granddad out of
yes, I know the exact incident you're talking about, yeah.
I've forgotten his name, but that was the same bloke who'd been messaging us. It was him who actually went into that hospital and got arrested for being a fucking
I was going to say,
nutjob.
yeah, he got nicked. He fully got nicked, and I think didn't someone in his family die as well in the end? It was quite a big story, and like,
His granddad was on an oxygen mask, and they came in, and the doctor was like, "Get the hell out of here!" And they were like, "It doesn't exist," and you're just like, "Yeah." And you saw the report, and he got arrested, but that was quite strange to have ended up seeing someone who'd just been an online nutter to being physically going into a hospital. And it dawned on me then, I thought, this is serious shit, because what if he turns up on my doorstep with a gun or something?
Have you had much harassment in the inbox and stuff, or does it kind of just filter into the unread messages?
Yeah, I had, it's died off now, but I had loads of messages from a mixture of just people saying, "Oh, loved your post, can you answer this and this," to people being really aggressive. And one guy, he looked like a real mean bastard. He was an MMA fighter, and he was basically saying that me and Fauci were going to get sent to prison and stuff. I was like,
yeah, because you and Tony Fauci just bowling down the street. He's at Summarise doing a shuffle in a corner. Right?
Yeah, he's doing the warm-up set. I'm just like, what is this guy on? And then I checked his wall, and he'd had 20 million views on his fight.
Wow.
And I was like, holy shit, this guy's a beast. And he looked like a big, But then I checked his stats, and I thought, if this guy keeps giving me any more shit, I'm just going to say, look, dude, you've been knocked out 50 times, so I fancy my chances. But he was a scary bastard, so I just thought, I kept being measured and saying, look, mate, you're talking nonsense, and said why. But he kept coming back and being quite aggressive. So I just said, look, dude, said I've had enough of you, I'm blocking you. And that was it. But yeah, getting on the wrong side of someone who could literally snap you in half was quite alarming.
When you look at the other side of that coin, though, you're looking at someone with all of that muscle who is absolutely terrified of a vaccine. So
yeah, and seemingly not terrified of a virus that could do some damage. But yeah,
it's bizarre. I think some of my favorite ones were when people were telling me that hospitals were empty. That was hilarious. Especially, I had one guy on Twitter replied to I tweeted something in defense of the NHS staff because my dad was in King's. He didn't have COVID. My dad's got I'll speak openly on this podcast. My dad's got stage 5 kidney failure, and he ended up being really, really sick in 2020. And he's managing now. He's on dialysis and stuff, and he's doing okay. But yeah, so he was in a coma for a good few weeks, to the point where when we were in Italy, they actually thought he was going to die. Like, I almost had to come back. And yeah, I'd go there, couldn't really do a lot. I'd take a book and just kind of chill in the ICU. It was at the time where you could have a visitor, because they had 2 separate ICUs. They had one for COVID and one for non-COVID. And I'd go in there, and almost every bed was full with a non-COVID patient. And I'd talk to doctors, and I'd say to them, "Oh, my missus works at such and such hospital, and I know doctors there, I know this guy, and blah blah blah." And became really friendly with them all. And I'd talk to them, a lot of them, when they'd be checking on my dad and doing his vitals and stuff. I'd have conversations with them, and get to know people. And I went there a few times, and I remember I tweeted about it on my way home one day. I was coming home on the bus, and some guy was, "Oh, the hospitals are empty," and blah blah blah. And I was like, "Mate, I literally sat next to my dying father in a fucking hospital today, surrounded by patients, non-COVID," because he was basically saying that they've cleared out the hospitals. They're not treating anyone who doesn't have COVID. That's all they care about now. And I'm like, mate, I literally sat in a ward with a guy on like kidney failure. The other dude over there had been in a bike accident and had a broken spine, and he was recovering. And then the other dude over there had something else. And it's like, there's people sitting there with their family. And I just thought, you dickhead. Like, it was just, I wasn't even, I was angry, but I just thought, you know what, I'm angry, but I'm not. Yeah.
People like Katie Hopkins who
and the people that were
nonsense.
the people that were filming in hospital foyers as well, and doing that. Well, I'm here today at such and such hospital, and as you can see, there are no COVID patients. Just like, sorry, Darren, did you expect him to be hooked up to Costa? Like, you're walking around a foyer saying that there's no COVID patients. It's like going to a football match on a day where a team is not playing and saying that the atmosphere was shit. It's like, what planet are you fucking from? Those are some of my favorite ones. The worst.
Well, did you see the guys who went into the hospital and started giving out all those folders of information that they'd said that was to do with the Nuremberg.
Yeah.
You want to read through that. And I just wish she'd just gone and went, oh, great, and just dropped them all into a bin and said, now fucking get out.
Yeah.
That's what I'd have done.
The trouble is the NHS staff are seriously scared. I used to say to my missus, like during the height of even the first wave, because there was a whole thing about people stealing NHS badges and stuff off of medics as they were leaving hospitals. I was like, do me a favor, hide your shit when you leave the hospital. And for the most part, if you're doing nights, I am going to try and come and meet you from work, because did not trust what was going on with some of these people in society. So I know
poisonous people.
Yeah, a lot of these people are dangerous people, man. Like it's brainwashing craziness. And as I say,
shouldn't be allowed to walk in like that and do that. They weren't wearing masks. They were just arguing with the staff. It's like they need security to just get them out and manhandle them if they need to. Just get them out of the hospital and kick them outside, basically.
Magna Carta, my human rights. Magna Carta, fuck you. No, you're not even a human. How can you have rights? Do you know what I mean? Like, it just, these people were insane. But I think the worst one for me, and there's been some silly stuff, and as I say, 27 degrees, it can't survive, but yet your body's 37, so clearly it can. What is it, like direct sunlight kills the virus, go and have a sunbed or whatever, and all this other nonsense. And
because Brazil were fine, weren't they?
Yeah. The 5G stuff was hysterical. But again, the people that work for BT who are out there just fixing people's internet and getting attacked in the street because of some batshit nonsense.
Well, actually, some old woman came up to one of those engineers and started having a right go at him, saying, "Oh, so it's causing all these problems." He went, "Sorry, madam, I haven't even switched it on yet."
The funniest one for me is when someone was telling me about it at work, and I was like, "Who's your internet provider?" And they were like, "BT." I said, "Have you got one of them home hubs?" And he went, "Yeah." I said, "Yeah, we got 5G in your living room, mate." He went, "What?" I went, "Literally, 5 gigahertz signal goes from your router to your laptop. Did you not know that?" And he was like, No. What, they've installed it in my house? Honestly, it's unbelievable stuff. The absolute worst one for me, and it's quite sad because I used to be very good friends with this person. And what's really, really upsetting is they're actually qualified to be a vet. They actually understand, science and how things jump through, viruses and animals and stuff. But they've gone fully immersed in this, very pro-Trump, anti-vax, pro quotes unquote freedom stuff, to the point where we no longer speak. During the first couple of weeks of the pandemic, hit me up and was just like, your missus works in hospital, right? Yeah. So how real is this thing? It's pretty fucking real. They've been trying to build, for people that don't know, we touched on it earlier, but they were literally building wards inside wards to deal with, as you said, surge capacity. They were splitting ventilators, for people that were related to each other. They were doing all kinds of different stuff that they could possibly do to increase capacity, bearing in mind that they did not have the staff to manage those beds. For anyone who doesn't know, in an ICU, you would normally have one nurse, one patient. You would have one nurse that deals with one patient. During the height of COVID, that one nurse was dealing with 4, if not 6 patients. Now, they were stretched beyond capacity. It was absolutely insane. Anyway, this person would ask me these questions and I would just be like, look, it's really, really bad. This thing is legit. They're preparing for the absolute worst. Hopefully it doesn't get that bad, but they've seen patients already. This is central London. It's not good. It's just not good at all. And she was like, "Oh, but I don't think it's that bad," and blah blah blah, and then sent me a link to Plandemic, that documentary.
Yeah.
And I
did a post on Plandemic on both of them.
I was like, you're someone who's studied and to the point where I said, "Do you know what? I'll watch it. I'll be fair, and I'll watch it." About 6 or 7 minutes in, when you have credits that roll up on the bottom of the screen, this is a doctor, professor of blah blah blah, it was spelt incorrectly. And I went, you expect me to believe this over the eyewitness account of the only person in my life who I actually give a shit about? Fuck off.
That was so appalling, that Plandemic documentary.
But this is what I'm saying.
It was pathetic.
This is why I have some sympathy with people who are just scared, because if a person who I've been friends with for a decade can sort of sit there and tell me that my missus is part of a grand conspiracy, that 1.2 million people in the NHS are all in on the conspiracy, plus their families. If you can sit there and tell me that, the world's gone. Like
They've gone
it's gone.
fully into the rabbit hole.
And that was at the
We've
start
got
of the
people
pandemic.
like
I don't even know
that.
how bad they are now. Like,
Well, there's something funny as well. There's a mate of mine who, I was mates with him at uni, and we were in a WhatsApp group, and he started to drop in bits of nonsense early on, and I sort of ignored it, and I thought, but then he started going in and saying this is all a complete load of nonsense. So I started arguing back, and he wasn't even reading what I was writing. He was just saying that's bullshit, and he was just arguing loads of crap. So I left the group eventually because I'd had enough of him. And as time went on, I realised that every time he'd share something in the group, because he wasn't on social media, he was 6 months out of date. And I was like, Jesus Christ, guys, this guy's behind the wake of the bullshit, and he's not even keeping up to date on that. And he's just completely down the rabbit hole as well.
Do you think there's any coming back for these people? I mean, when COVID's, pretty much seasonal illness, and we get to that stage where it's kind of just there. How do we get these people back? Do we? Where do they go next? This is something that fascinates me, because what do they cling on to now? Like, I just once it goes and we've stopped wearing masks and people are just vaccinating whenever, which pretty much I think we can all see is exactly what's going to happen. And when Bill Gates doesn't kill half of the population, where do they go? How do we get these
I
people
think
back? Because it's quite sad.
it is very sad, but the QAnon, there was a lot of people who suddenly realised that was bollocks, who were following it.
Yeah.
So there will be a number of people who suddenly just think, actually, I thought it was all going to be going into this weird new society and all this, and we'll go back to normal, and they'll realise. But there'll be some who will just continue to follow other conspiracy nonsense they find online and just keep going. Climate change is a big one.
Yeah.
They'll just follow on into that
Yeah.
and talk nonsense around that.
Yeah, anything to kind of jump on. You do notice, like, they talk about the Venn diagram of conspiracies and people falling into certain things. Really interesting, actually. I don't know. Do you listen to a fair few podcasts, I'm guessing?
Yeah.
So I listened to one that's a BBC podcast, but it was on Spotify, and it's called The Coming Storm. And it's all about the origins of QAnon and how it came to be. And it all started.
I was looking for this yesterday. I'd forgotten the name of it. Right, I'll watch it.
So good. The episodes are only about 30 to 40 minutes long. It's fucking amazing. Like, he goes into, and I recommend for any of my listeners, like, go and listen to this podcast. It's called The Coming Storm. It's on Spotify. It's a BBC Sounds podcast. And it started off in 1993 with one of Bill Clinton's staff killed himself in a park in his car. And people took that, and there was a conspiracy theory then on the early version of the internet about, actually, it was Hillary and Bill that killed that guy. They had him killed. And that's where the birth of QAnon begins. And I won't ruin the full story, but this guy interviews the guy who invented 4chan, 8chan, all of these different things. He actually meets the Q shaman, the guy with the horns and the fuzzy thing, doesn't realize quite how significant he's going to be when he actually meets him, and then realizes when he's watching telly 3 months later, oh my God, like, that guy's in the Capitol. Interviews his friends, like, all kinds of stuff. I urge anyone who wants to get some real clarity on how conspiracy theories spread out of control to go and listen to The Coming Storm.
I'd watched the other documentary I'd mentioned. I watched that. The other one I'd mentioned, they decided that the guy who was going on 4chan, who was Q, they reckon that the possibility that he was just doing it for a laugh.
Yeah, so they delve into this podcast, and basically one of the guys that set up, so he was on 4chan, and he was your typical incel disabled guy, never had a girlfriend, literally lived in his mum's basement, and he was just memeing and shit posting on 4chan, and he created 8chan, which is an even more sort of nasty version of it. And he was contacted by two guys, a father and a son, who live in the Philippines. And they're two American guys. They flew him out to the Philippines. They met him in Hong Kong, and they brought him to their house, and they basically went into business on 8chan, just shit posting and just making money from ads and everything else. And the rumor is that the father, the main guy, is Q. Like, it's one of the points of the story. They can never really establish who it is, but they think that if there's a prime suspect, it's this guy. And he's literally just a trash bag, like, just an absolute out and out trash bag. But yeah, the QAnon stuff is fucking wild. But that podcast is, mate, well worth a listen. I think it's about 7 or 8 episodes. There's that, and I've been also listening to the trial of Ghislaine Maxwell. There's a podcast by a guy called John Sweeney who's on the Global app, and he did an entire podcast series about her growing up and her father being who he was and everything else, and that he's been in the courtroom during the trial and some of the shit that's come out there. And I know that side of things kind of feeds into the Q stuff as well, so it's been interesting to listen to all of them. But
well, the interesting thing about QAnon is it's like a modern day version of what happened with Scientology in a way, because you had Ron Hubbard say you could literally invent a religion and people would follow it, and then invented Scientology, and look how massive that became. And then you've got the internet sort of social media version of this type of brainwashing, and QAnon's a great example of that.
Yep, 100%. Well, mate, I hope that we've kind of dispelled some of the myths around vaccines, and I would urge anyone to look at Kieren's Facebook and look at some of the posts over the last couple of years and just read through some of the responses he's given to people. That some of them have asked fairly legitimate questions, others have just asked him some bullshit or come at him from mad angles. I've actually got one that I'm going to read, and this is my favorite one. I saved this on my phone earlier, and I'm doing another podcast tomorrow. The guy I'm talking to tomorrow, I said to him, I was like, mate, I cannot wait for this podcast tonight. And I sent him this screenshot and he was like, oh, this is going to be great. So I can't remember exactly when this was that you posted this. It got reposted recently. And it says, no, an mRNA vaccine will not make you infertile. It's based on producing the spike protein of the actual COVID virus. You may have noticed that COVID itself doesn't appear to make you infertile. Suggesting the syncytin, I can't pronounce that word, 1, has a significant sequence homology to the spike protein that may confer cross-reactivity is more desperate bollocks from Mike Yeadon. The spike protein is 1,273 amino acids long and has a region of about 5 amino acids that align to syncytin 1. You will find this for any other protein, example hemoglobin or collagen. If this insignificant amount of homology caused cross-reactivity, we'd have much bigger problems than infertility. People would literally die immediately after birth. A final point, why would Yeadon advocate young people to just aim for herd immunity if the spike protein of COVID caused infertility? This is more confirmation for me that he's an utter crackpot. Now, basically what you're saying in that is the part of the vaccine, the mRNA vaccine that people claim makes you infertile is actually prevalent in COVID itself. So COVID would make you infertile in theory if that was the case. And the first comment is, I won't read her name out. LOL. And on what credentials are people supposed to believe this individual? And you say, who? Me? She replies, what pharmaceutical and scientific qualifications do you have? Where did you study? And how many years professional experience do you have in the field you're giving your advice opinion on, please? And here we go. I'm a senior scientist with a degree in biology, master's in genetics, PhD in genetics, and I worked in disease research for 20 years, with the last 10 in viral genomics and public health. Yours? Complete silence, mate. An absolutely beautiful takedown. But I do urge people to go and look at Kieren's Facebook if you want to read more stuff like that and just, read fact-based comments and conversations. It's been amazing to watch, and it's been amazing to have you on, mate. Where can people follow you on social media and check out all of the stuff for Summarise Sessions and your music as well?
Yeah, it's just Kieren Lythgow on Facebook. That's where I do all my posts on the virus or flyers for events. So it's quite a weird difference of information going out there. So
you'll notice there was a balance that during lockdown there was no flyers for events, and all of a sudden it went back to normal.
Yeah, exactly. That's why I post less on as we get. It's a sign of normality approaching, hopefully.
Yeah, absolutely.
But yeah, just mainly Facebook is where I post that sort of stuff. I'm rarely on Twitter and things like that, just because that is a bottomless pit of craziness for me.
Yeah, well, Facebook isn't.
Well, at least you refine to your friend lists, but again, it's a public profile. But yeah, Twitter is a different ballgame.
Yeah,
it's been great talking to you.
Mate, it's been really, really fun to have you on, and I'll definitely try, and if you've got any small gigs in London for a fogey like me who doesn't like going raving anymore, I might pop along at some point if I can.
Yeah, definitely.
But yeah, I'll put a link in the YouTube video and in a Spotify description and everything else to your Facebook and to, and point people in the direction of Summarise Sounds. Once again, mate, thank you so much for your time and for coming on. Yeah, make sure you follow in, share, subscribe to the podcast, all of that good stuff. If you're a new listener and you're here because of Kieren, Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening to the show. Thank you for watching the show. Please do go back and listen to some of the episodes that we've got. If you're here for the house music, Scott Diaz, Tough Love, loads of different DJ Blaze, loads of different house producers and house DJs, old school garage producers like Brass Tooth and various people like that are on the podcast, and people from across the spectrum of house music, Cy Says, Wes Wint, loads of different people are on the pod. So do go back and listen to the old episodes. If you're into pirate radio, there's plenty of content there for you as well. And yeah, mate, once again, thank you very much for coming on, and hopefully see you soon.
Yeah, it's been an absolute pleasure, James. Thanks very much, mate. Great talking to you. See you soon.